As humans continue to rapidly accelerate, replacing ourselves with robot overlords, or otherwise see if we can't make Wall-E into a prophetic mockumentary, one group of Homo sapiens refuses to go quietly into the night. And while it may come as a surprise to you, this group is seemingly set to inherit the Earth, given their population is exploding, whilst birth rates for the rest of us are declining to an extent that most developed nations are already well past the point where their coming generations will be significantly smaller than the current. But not so much for our butter-churning brethren. We are, of course, speaking of the Amish, who provide for us a stark contrast to our fast-paced, egocentric lives with their staunch and deliberate refusal to get swept up in any of it. But is Amish life really as idyllic as it appears from the outside? And just what is the reality of life as an Amish person really like? Well, hitch up your buggy and let's walk through the valley where they harvest their grain, shall we? To begin with, it's important to point out that there are a bit over 36 distinct Amish groups and countless communities within those, with a surprising amount of variance in terms of what's acceptable within one community versus another. That's not to say there are no universals. For example, one thing you'll find in every Amish community is a fierce sense of family and community, with members focusing on minimalistic, humble lives. On that latter point, likely a million times as humble as thou art, with a rejection of highlighting the individual in the sense that standing out or acting like you're something special, or what we might call Kardashian attention, would definitely see you shunned from the community. Which, I mean, well, I've just had an idea. Well, we'll get to the specifics of shunning in a little bit, but going back to humility, this is seen as a boon to community harmony, as well as just a key tenet of practicing their faith. And this brings us to another universal amongst Amish groups, their specific brand of Christianity, centered on the teachings of the Bible as interpreted by them. To be Amish is to belong to this faith. To reject the faith is to reject being Amish, and you will not be allowed to stay in the community past a certain age. While exact beliefs vary a bit from Amish group to Amish group, in an oversimplified nutshell, they put God and community above the individual, and as mentioned, and strive to live a simple and humble life, with that simplicity being a sign of humility and separating themselves from worldly things. Specific rules for a given community lie in the respective community's ordnung, and once baptized into the church, which is a choice you make as an adult, you are strictly bound by these rules and the will of your community, or with each community being self-governed. The Amish also pretty universally highlight forgiveness and are staunchly pacifists, even to the point that if a local boy kicked them in the butt last week, they would really likely smile and turn that other cheek. But to sum up, they have a firm belief that part of living the good life is to be dedicated to creating a hardworking and loving community kept separate from the world to help shield it from negative outside factors as much as possible. As one Amish man named Sam notes, "I can see the big changes they have brought to society, which my children will never see. There is more independence on the individual level, but people have become more selfish. Everything is for themselves. We value the idea of working for the betterment of everyone. Christ said, we are to be a light to the world. We are not saying we want everyone to be Amish or that we are better, but our goal in a selfish society is to show people that it works if we are honest in our dealings, respect people, and go the extra mile." And if you're wondering why we only use Sam's first name in citing that quote, this once again comes back to the humility thing. In interviews, most Amish people either prefer to remain anonymous or that only their first name be used. But in any event, as for community structure and leadership in such a group where selflessness and humility are the name of the game, they do still have leadership of a sort. For example, each community of families elects a bishop, ministers, and a deacon. That said, when we say the community elects these individuals, this is only in part. While a vote is taken for this, when it comes to the final selection of who has what role from those who receive the most votes in the community, this is typically done at random, something to the effect of drawing straws to see who gets what position, more or less leaving it to God in a sense. From there, these individuals' job is to help guide the community and decide what technologies and changes to allow or not, as well as to lead worship services, which are typically conducted every other Sunday in one of the houses of the community. More specifically, typically the bishop is more or less the leader of the community and guides what the community needs to vote on or not and the like, with ministers and deacons being more central to church services, such as the ministers doing the actual preaching. As for the deacon, they are the ones who typically privately discuss transgressions with community members to correct behavior to align to the will of the community. Moving on to education. The education system for the Amish isn't exactly as robust as their non-Amish compatriots, with formal schooling stopping at the 8th grade level, after which more trade-like instruction is the focus. As to why, it's generally thought that up to an 8th grade education is sufficient for an Amish life, which, as ever, focuses on just enough to get by with something, but no more. As to the nuts and bolts of their education, the children are usually taught by unmarried older teen girls in the community in a one-room schoolhouse type setting, where kids of all ages learn at the same time, though with specific assignments and lessons tailored to the individual's level. That said, in about 10% of Amish communities, the parents send their children to regular public schools alongside the non-Amish. But even in these cases, formal education stops at around the 8th grade level, a matter of some contention once upon a time between the Amish and the US government. As for their houses, the typical Amish home isn't really all that different from many traditional American-style houses, albeit a bit more rustic in some ways. For example, in place of electric ovens, you'll typically find a wood or gas stove, with heat likewise being provided in a similar way. In place of light bulbs, you'll usually find gas lamps, lanterns, and candles. Depending on the community, you'll even find a refrigerator, just usually gas-powered rather than electric. Similarly, you may find something like a washing machine, though instead of electrically powered, likely using air power, with the ultimate source for the power for the air compressor often being a community generator or solar and battery bank setup. Dryers, however, are not generally found, with clothes going on a clothesline. Another thing many Amish homes feature is a large open area, perhaps an open basement, designed to make it easier for a community church service or event to be held there. But otherwise, an Amish house is very similar to many other homes you'll find anywhere, sans electric plugs and TVs, and the furniture being perhaps more sturdy than your typical IKEA special. As for day-to-day life, as you'd expect from a more traditional society, the women tend to perform tasks such as cooking and cleaning and other such jobs around the house, while the men work outside the home providing for the family. That said, in more liberal Amish communities in recent decades, this has begun to change to an extent, with some Amish women even starting and running businesses. As for the jobs the Amish get up to, this has changed markedly in recent decades. Classically, the vast majority of Amish were very skilled farmers. While this is still a trade many Amish perform on some level, giving rising prices of land and, in some cases, how much a given Amish can sell their land for instead, the majority of work done by the Amish in modern times tends to lie outside of mass farming, sometimes in extremely lucrative ways, with Amish millionaires absolutely being a thing. However, within the community, no one would ever be celebrated as such, and flaunting this fact would be a huge no-no. But as for professions outside of being men of the land, common jobs Amish take up include everything from carpentry and various other construction work to even tourism and running restaurants. On the note of building things, if you've purchased an RV in the United States, there's a strong chance an Amish person helped build it, which is kind of ironic in a lot of respects when you think about it. Not just functioning as skilled factory workers, it's not uncommon at all for Amish to set up their own businesses with shockingly high success rates, in this at around 90%. For reference, us lesser mortals who aren't on our knees day and night scoring points for the afterlife see only about a 35% success rate for our businesses at the 10-year mark. As to why the Amish have such high success rates in their businesses, there are a variety of factors that go into this, from how invested their family and their community are in their success and endeavors, to arguably the biggest factor being plain old extreme hard work and extreme pride in their work. Although on this latter point, it's important to point out it's not to glorify themselves, but rather God. Producing a subpar product or not giving it your best effort would not be glorifying God in your work, and thus it's perhaps unsurprising that the Amish are known for their products being extremely high quality. They also, by nature of leading minimalistic lives, tend to increase the odds of their businesses succeeding, whereas others with higher expenditures might have to quit and try something else. Thus, hard work, community, and family support, keeping expenses low and producing quality products or services turns out to be a recipe for long-term success in business, which is shocking, we know. As for their work ethic, this is something that's instilled in any Amish person from a young age, taking the whole tenet of by the sweat of your brow from Genesis to heart to an extreme degree. Even Amish children get in on things, beginning work of some sort to help the family at quite young ages. For example, one former Amish, Ira Wagler, author of Growing Up Amish, notes, "I was taken to the top of our house, given a goose wing, and made to sweep steps as my job when I was only 3. The message is you do not deserve anything unless it's earned." Noteworthy here is putting the kids to work at young ages, sometimes in official businesses, and much like with their schooling practices, this has sometimes caused issues with the US government when it butts up against certain child labor laws. That said, while children are expected to help out in the family and community in pretty much everything they are able to do from the first day they're able, there's fun too, just more akin to fun from years of yore rather than more modern times on tablets, phones, and the internet. Instead, outdoor recreation and board games and the like are the name of the game for fun, but being Amish, where hard work and sacrifice are part of living in an Amish paradise, there's also often an element of work to some of the fun, with things like quilting bees and the like being popular fun activities centered around doing something productive, in this case, making quilts while also socializing. As for the scale some of these Amish businesses can reach, one unnamed Amish man has grown his business to over 500 employees, despite the fact that he didn't start it until he was 50. In another case, an Amish cabinet making business produces some 6,000 units per day, with Amish-made cabinets, furniture, and other such things being sought after for the quality of their products. And we'll get into how one manages such a large business in a bit from a practical standpoint when we discuss the reality of Amish and their use of modern technology. But for now, we'll just say it's really not as difficult as you might think, even when dealing with non-Amish companies and employees. Beyond producing goods, as alluded to, some Amish groups have also in recent decades embraced the outside world's fascination with them to an extent, setting up tourism-type businesses. While you might think that if you come for a visit you'll be bored to tears, visiting Amish communities has become increasingly popular, allowing people to come and see what their community is like, while also selling products like homemade baked goods and crafts like quilts to tourists. Some have even set up restaurants where you can go to experience authentic Amish cuisine, which, given so much of their recreational lives center around socializing while eating, and half of their populace are practically master chefs using natural foods, their cuisine is reportedly very good. That said, one thing to note if you do go to a community who offers such tourism of a sort, or even just see an Amish person out and about, is to not whip out your phone and take a picture of them, nor even ask to take a picture. The former would be rude in any circle, but even more so for the Amish, who don't exactly like it when people point and stare. But so much more than that, even on the latter of taking a picture with them, given the Amish attitudes towards an individual standing out and their focus on humility and the whole biblical commandment of thou shalt not make unto thyself a graven image, they are generally pretty anti being featured in photos. Granted, it's not like they can stop you from taking a picture from afar, but it's just good to know that you're committing something of a cultural faux pas when you do it, especially if they are central to the picture and not just more or less in the background. Either way, it's unlikely to be appreciated, to put it mildly. Although you'll not ever see an Amish person punch a tourist, even if he deserved it, and an Amish with an attitude is indeed almost unheard of. But going back to work, much like non-Amish life, Amish families must find ways to support themselves, pay taxes, make money to buy things at Walmart, and most of all the other stuff that non-Amish do. They even generally use modern banks and the like. The difference primarily being, first, they live much simpler lives without acquiring anything but the essential goods for life, and thus often have significantly fewer expenses overall, and second, instead of buying clothes made in some far-off nation, they tend to make them themselves. Many communities are also relatively self-sufficient when it comes to a lot of staple food items as well, although this isn't nearly as true in more recent times as it once was, and many communities rely on the outside world's ecosystem for many raw materials. And speaking of clothing, as you no doubt have guessed from an individual standing out from the community being something of a no-no, Amish clothing is pretty much universally extremely plain, with solid colours or simple patterns being just perfect, and embellishments or anything that says, look at me, being strictly forbidden. And in fact, Amish communities have strict guidelines on all of this, even down to the exact allowable hat brim width on a hat for men, although specifics vary from community to community. It's also noteworthy that there are some things clothing can potentially indicate, such as whether a girl is married or not. For example, Amish women typically do not ever cut their hair and instead wear it in a bun with a prayer covering bonnet over it. While, as ever, things vary from community to community, in a given community, married women might also wear one colour, such as white, for their bonnet, and unmarried another colour, such as black. As for men, their homies do indeed agree that they look good in black, and a beard on their chin usually indicates that the man is married. Speaking of facial hair, if you're wondering on the whole beard but no mustache thing that the Amish have going on, this tradition stems back to the early days of the Amish, when wearing elaborate mustaches was almost universally for those in the military. In fact, from 1860 to 1916, if you were a member of the British military, you were actually required to have a mustache. In their early days, the Amish and other Mennonites in Europe were persecuted by these groups. In addition to that, the Amish, being once again a pacifist group, they didn't want to associate themselves with those who waged war, so strictly forbid their members from growing moustaches. On their note of being pacifists, this has caused the Amish some issues in the past, such as during World War I, where some were drafted but would refuse to fight or participate in the war, seeing most drafted spending the war in prison for this, as well as being subjected to a variety of abuses. World War II was slightly improved on this front, but those drafted were still required to do alternate work in the modern world for the cause, which was quite a culture shock for many and infringed in many ways on their religious beliefs. And going back to marriage, given the emphasis put on family and giving glory to God through being a boon to your community, choosing not to get married isn't really a thing among the Amish, though contrary to popular belief, marriages aren't arranged. Rather, as a teen Amish begins to approach marriageable age, the boys will begin being allowed to court the girls and interact in new ways. And this brings us to the practice of rumspringa, a period usually starting at around 16 and ending at around 18 to 22, where in some Amish communities the youths are no longer considered quite as subject to their parents' oversight, but also not baptized into the church either, so they're allowed to be a little more free with themselves than they will be once they choose to join the church officially. That said, while many documentaries and shows that cover this would have you believe rumspringa is a time when Amish youths go off and have wild drug and alcohol-infused orgies for a few years, this isn't really for most, though we'll get into the more wild side in just a bit. In fact, many communities, particularly smaller ones, don't really allow much of any additional freedoms of this nature at all, more just a general acknowledgement that young people aren't going to live up to the code of expected behaviours as rigidly as adults, and consequences for them are sometimes more lax as a result, even with the occasional looking the other way completely. However, when factoring in that Amish codes of behaviour are extremely strict, this slight lessening for these youths would probably still seem very strict for most raised outside of an Amish community. With, in many communities, about the most the rules becoming relaxed, being allowed teen boys and girls to participate in something called singings, though even then, in some communities, these are chaperoned by parents. As one former Amish woman, Misty Griffin, notes, in strict Amish communities like I belong to, teenagers are usually required to be baptized at 17 years old, the same age they start dating and going to youth singings. If they don't obey the church rules, they can be shunned. If they're shunned, they won't be allowed to date or attend youth social gatherings, and that is a big deal for a teenager. So they would usually try to avoid getting shunned. She also states, in the stricter Amish churches, young Amish women are held to a higher standard of behaviour than young men. Some of the teenage girls used to wonder about makeup, though, and tried to imagine what they would look like wearing it. That's about as far as it went among the girls in my church. Another former Amish man who remained unnamed stated, rumspringa was not allowed in my community. In my community, you either left or you didn't. You could return depending on the circumstances, but you would still be shunned for some time. It was not something that was allowed. Going back to singings, which does seem to be mostly a universal thing among Amish communities, these might be deemed a highly religious version of a nightclub in which the kids get together in a family home and sing gospel songs without instruments, as the Amish don't allow such. Then, after, they eat and socialise with one another. Once it's closing time, so to speak, if one of the young men wants to attempt to take things to the next level with one of the young women, he would typically then ask her to allow him to give her a ride home in his buggy. If all goes well, they will continue to focus on one another in their socialising endeavours. This often includes dates at the girl's home, where the young man socialises with the girl and her family, plays board games, etc. They also otherwise may write letters and the like. If in a community, which is also a bit more lax about what the youth are allowed to do or not, they may even in some cases use social media to correspond during this period, though obviously this isn't the norm in most Amish communities. But in communities that allow such extra freedoms, Facebook is apparently quite popular among the Amish youth. If things don't go well over the course of this style of dating, the whole thing may be repeated with other potential partners until they find someone they match well with on both sides. Again, with all this not really in some respects being that different than any other teen dating, except the marriage on the other side tending to be somewhat accelerated and the focus instead of continuing to date around into adulthood before settling down. Another quick point here is that unlike in the outside world, divorce is strictly forbidden in Amish communities, so once you're hitched for life if you want to remain Amish. Other activities besides singings that are quite common among Amish youth include playing sports like volleyball, baseball and bowling, as well as hiking and various outdoor parties generally centered around a picnic-type socializing event. All that said, particularly among regions where the Amish populace is quite large among a cluster of communities, there does in some cases exist a level of more wild debauchery if a particular youth wants to join a clique of other Amish youth that want to partake in such. This too, however, is not really that different than normal teens, with there always existing some wilder elements and other groups of friends who are more tame. However, even in these more wilder cases, it's typical for the youths to still live at home during this upwards of several years of their life. Just on the weekends, they may venture out into neighbouring non-Amish communities and partake in all modern life has to offer. Even then, in these so-called wild cases, for most this usually just involves things like using the internet, going to movies, maybe getting a driver's license, buying a cell phone, exchanging their plain Amish garb for more typical English fashion, as they call it, when out and about, maybe a more modern haircut, socialising via via social media and other such activities more or less typical of any teen. This may sometimes include partaking in alcohol at parties and premarital sex, but it's not really any more the norm, and arguably much less so than you'd find among most non-Amish teens, even for the Amish who venture out in this way. That said, also, much like any teen with extremely strict, overbearing parents, when they first get out on their own, some Amish youth quite enjoy partaking in a wild party life of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and even apparently have good luck with the opposite sex among the non-Amish, as noted by one Amish youth who stated, "The English girls prefer us Amish guys because we're stronger and better built and we party harder." He also likewise states the Amish girls are noted as quite wild when out and about on their own, Runspringer from his region, with English boys liking Amish girls better for their propensity to get hammered and eagerness to do anything after. That said, once again, these communities and this type of extreme behaviour are more the exception rather than the rule. Further, while you'll often read that Amish elders and parents actually encourage such sowing of oats, so the youths can really experience life outside of their Amish community and get it out of their system, this isn't typically accurate at all either, with most parents in communities that allow such venturing out as a common thing, typically doing what pretty much all non-Amish parents do too when their kids are going out with friends, urging them to make good choices and often requesting that they return by a certain time. As one Amish man, Dennis, states, "We don't give our young folks leave to go out and sin just to get it out of their system. What we give them is a little space so they can be with people their own age and find a partner." Which is all the real purpose of this period, deciding once and for all whether you wish to remain Amish, and if so, finding a partner to settle down with as quickly as possible. Now, given all the niceties of modern life and how much more freedom we have in it than the Amish, you might at first think a large proportion of Amish youth would choose to leave rather than return to the very strict and extremely hard-working life of an Amish person, especially for the women who in Amish communities are pretty much pigeonholed into a life of being baby factories, subservient to their husbands to an extent, and all manner of such things more associated with a woman's role throughout much of human history. But in fact, only about 1 in 15 Amish children choose to leave the community, though this does vary from community to community. And it's also noted that boys are much more likely to leave than girls. Combined with the high birth rates per family, upwards of about 7 to 10 littles per baby mama, this has seen Amish communities growing quite rapidly, with the entire North American populace of Amish in 1920 being only about 5,000 people, and today rapidly approaching 400,000, and expected to pass 1 million within about 15 years, with no slowing in sight. As to why so few choose to leave, consider it from the perspective of that Amish youth, instilled from birth with an extremely strong sense of family and community first over the individual. Leaving the community can be construed as tantamount to turning your back on your family and community in an extreme way. In fact, while every community and exact family situation is different, it's not uncommon for a teen who chooses to leave to be ostracized. On this, because they are not yet a member of the church officially, they won't usually technically be shunned by the church. However, they often are nonetheless virtually banned from a practical standpoint, or at least relationships are very strained if they do try to come back and visit their family and friends. And as you might imagine, leaving can also be quite traumatic for the individual. To suddenly be on your own without your community or family or friends to have your back, and even no longer really allowed much contact at all with them, if any. On top of that, being alone for the first time in your life when entering a world that is extremely foreign to you in many respects, and doing so with only the equivalent of, at best, an 8th grade education, and in some cases few marketable skills. As the aforementioned Misty Griffin notes, "When I entered the outside world, I realized I'd need to learn a whole different set of skills. No one was looking to hire a quilter or a noodle maker." And in some cases, the pressure to stay goes even further. While again, every community and family are different, there is, in many cases, a general perception of if you leave your community, you're going to go to hell, or it's the devil trying to tempt you away. As one Amish girl noted, "God talks to me in one ear, Satan in the other. Part of me wants to be Amish like my parents, but the other part wants the jeans, the haircut, to do what I want to do." That said, officially, this isn't usually the stance of their teachings, as the youth haven't yet chosen to join the church. For an Amish individual choosing to leave after being baptized, this would be a much more serious offense, and they absolutely would be shunned by the church. Misty Griffin notes this of 2 people she knew of who, like her, also left. They visited the Amish community once, but were only allowed to stay for a few hours. The rule of thumb if you're shunned is that you can only visit every few years. You would have to eat at a separate table. It's like this in most Amish churches, but some of the most liberal Amish churches have relaxed the shunning a bit. I do know that usually parents and siblings don't want to enforce the shunning policy, but they have to, or they'll be shunned themselves. Thus, from all of this, you can see why almost no one chooses to leave, and perhaps also why, in more recent times, rates of Amish youth leaving has actually been decreasing, presumably in part because the gap between typical Amish life and the modern world is ever growing. That said, some do choose to abscond, such as one Linda Byler, who decided to leave her community at the age of 23 so she could attend college, in her case at Penn State Shenango. She states, "I've always been a very curious person. I enjoyed school very much, but what we learned seemed so limited. When my older siblings went to school and brought home their textbooks, I would spend hours reading and looking through them. Once I started school, I learned about children in non-Amish schools who were learning more subjects, and I felt like I was being cheated. When I interacted with people outside my religion who attended regular public schools, it was so painfully obvious that they could learn and become whatever they chose to be, and I was confined to a very limited world. This is when education and learning really became a passion of mine, and I would constantly read the dictionary and the encyclopedia. I was just being the person who I felt I was." As for her leaving, she states, "Even though I felt pressure from members of the community to join the church from the time I turned 18 years old, I would not do it. I did not believe in the doctrine, and so it would be much easier on my family if I never joined." Ultimately, she was able to live with a non-Amish family she'd previously done housekeeping for and got her GED and ultimately attended college and graduated with a 4.0 with a degree in business administration, going on to become an investment accountant. She concludes, "There are so many beautiful, positive things about the Amish. However, there are some parts I did not believe in, nor could I follow. Through all this, however, I can honestly say that I drew from what my parents taught me at a young age. To work hard, be free, but most of all, stay true to myself. I will always love them for what they taught me, and I know that they would be very proud of my accomplishments." In another case, one unnamed Amish man chose to leave his community because of the conveniences of modern life that he was missing out on. He states, "I remember cutting firewood and just wishing I had a chainsaw to make it easier. I feel like I always knew I would leave, but just waited until I grew older. But that easily the hardest thing was leaving my family and knowing how disappointed my parents would be." As often happens, once again, this decision cost him his family and community. "I was told not to come back unless I planned to stay Amish. I was never baptized, so it's not considered shunning by the church. I was disowned by my family." Matters for him weren't exactly helped given his choice to not only leave, but to join the military after doing so, something the extremely pacifist Amish could never really accept. As to why he chose the military, he states it appealed to him because of the structure, the rules. They both tell you how to cut your hair and what to wear. Also, there is a similar sense of community or family. A much darker reason to leave the community was in the case of the aforementioned Misty Griffin, who did so to escape being sexually abused by her local bishop. Yet, despite biblical doctrine, family, and community, and all of that being integral to Amishing, as with any group of humans, awful people exist everywhere, even if generally a minority in most communities. She says of all of this, "I was raised as Amish by my mother and stepfather from about 6 years old. They were incredibly abusive and isolated my sister and me on a remote mountain ranch in northern Washington state. I think our extreme religious appearance led to people leaving us alone, which benefited my mother and stepfather. At 19, I tried to escape the ranch, but my sister and I were taken to a strict Amish community and informally adopted by 2 separate families. We became baptized church members. My sister and I believed 100% that we had to be Amish or we'd go to hell." As for the bishop, she states, "As soon as I moved in with the bishop, he started sexually assaulting me. I was quiet about it. I would have shouldered some of the blame if I had come forward. But after about 6 months, I became suspicious the bishop was molesting his 12-year-old daughter too, after catching him hastily buttoning her dress back up one day. So I decided to go to the police. Among many Amish communities, going to the police is severely frowned upon. Sexual predators are often shunned for 6 weeks, then taken back into the church, and children are not taken out of their homes. So I knew I had to report him to the police, but the police told me I didn't have enough evidence for them to charge him, and a month later, he moved to Canada with his whole family. The detective told me there was nothing more we could do, as if there was no paper trail. Finally, after 7 years, I started to write my memoir to raise awareness of child and sexual abuse in strict religious communities. 2 years after it was published, the bishop came back into the US and his oldest daughters reported him for child abuse in an attempt to save their youngest sister. The detective that was called in happened to be reading my memoir at the time. I was put in contact with the children and the bishop was sentenced to 10 years in prison for child sexual abuse. As for leaving, she states, the hardest part was trying to block out the idea I'd go to hell. The Amish believe that if you're baptized into their church and then leave, you will 100% go to hell. When you have believed something your whole life, you can't just get over it in a few days. So even though I felt I was doing the right thing, there were moments when I was afraid and questioned myself. The biggest physical challenge was that I didn't know how to survive or act in the outside world. I didn't know how to get a job. I had only a 3rd grade education. It felt like being teleported from the 19th century into the 21st. I put on a brave face, but in reality I was terrified. She also states, in her community, which was much more isolated than most, they would tell her about the outside world, quote, that it was dangerous, that everyone was trying to kidnap you, take advantage of you, and use you for their own personal gain. For actual leaving, she says, I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I left early one morning. A non-Amish couple drove me to Seattle. When leaving the Amish, no one usually says goodbye. You'll just be met with more lectures on going to hell. But I actually saw the bishop and his wife watching from the window. No one physically tries to stop you when you leave the Amish, but they don't help you either. You leave with nothing. I went to live near Seattle, Washington. My stepfather's older sister took me in and gave me a job at a furniture store. She was nothing like her brother. She was a very kind and gracious woman. She helped me enter modern society and got me on my feet. Not just big things. Many little things were also an adjustment. She states, almost everything on the outside seems strange. For example, I had to learn to use deodorant. I found it very strange to brush something under my arms. I'd seen it before, but hadn't understood what it was. I thought it was a form of solid perfume. I also found it exhausting to pick out the clothes to wear every day. In strict Amish communities like where I'm from, you only have 2 work dresses, then a few church dresses in different colours. Everything felt loud and scary. The electric lights hurt my eyes, and I was constantly turning them off. I was even scared of the hairdryer at first because it made so much noise. I felt very overwhelmed for about 6 months. That said, it wasn't all bad. She goes on, one of the best things was not feeling like I was constantly being watched anymore, like people were looking for me to make a mistake so they could tell the minister. Everyone on the outside world was kind. They encouraged me to embrace my talents and be myself, unlike in the Amish community where you're pressured to conform. I also really enjoyed going to different restaurants and trying different foods. But probably the most amazing thing about the outside world was running water hot and cold. I still marvel at this sometimes. I no longer had to heat water on top of the wood stove. As for those who choose to remain, however, as noted, they can look forward to being baptized in the church, and once done, they're eligible to get married and are also now very strictly subject to their community rules. Usually not long after this occurs, the individual will also get married, though this isn't always immediate, with some needing a bit more courting time. In these cases, even though technically considered adults, they are still usually allowed to take part in the singings and other such youth events where they can continue to party like it's 1699. From here, they get to work at their chosen profession and generally get to making babies, with birth control almost universally strictly forbidden in Amish communities, except for in certain communities if a particular woman is found to be at very high risk of extreme complications should she get pregnant again. In these cases, she may be allowed to use birth control of some sort if her and her husband decide that it's right to do so. But even on this one, many such things are simply left up to what God's will would be. That said, even in a community where birth control is not allowed even for such a high-risk individual, as we've covered before, the pull and pray method isn't just effective for those who pray like the Amish, but for anyone. This method, also known as coitus interruptus, or the withdrawal method, was for most of human history one of the most popular methods of preventing pregnancy, but in recent times has been cast aside in many cultures. It turns out, though, that as long as you get the pull part right, there really isn't much praying necessary. According to research done in 2008 at the Guttmacher Institute in New York, the withdrawal method, when executed perfectly, is 96% effective over the course of a year, practicing it for preventing pregnancy. For comparison, using a condom when done perfectly is 98% effective in that same year, and oral contraception has a perfect use rate of 99.7% effective. Now, this is when all 3 methods are done perfectly, so what about in actual practice with everyday people? The pull and pray method is roughly 82% effective, while using a condom is roughly 83% effective, so you are only getting a 1% improvement for all your money and effort. The pill, in contrast, does offer a much better actual use rate of about 96%. But as strengthening your community and family via popping out babies is a way to give glory to God, let's just say the Amish in general aren't likely to bother with even this form of birth control, with, as mentioned, the average Amish woman popping out about 7 to 10 children in their lifetime. Now, you might think that an awful lot of Amish women must die in the process of this then, given historically women giving birth this many times without the aid of modern hospital facilities didn't exactly have the best survival rates, with infant mortality rates likewise not always ideal. On this, about half of all children didn't make it to adulthood until about a century or so ago. But this is not actually the case here among the Amish. You see, while in general most Amish do embrace more natural medicines and things of this nature, many communities are happy to utilize modern medicine in hospitals, and even vaccination rates among the Amish are actually relatively high. No doubt they haven't heard about all the mind-controlling chips that Bill Gates puts in the vaccines to get us to use Windows. But in any event, in a minority of communities, having your baby in a hospital is also accepted, even without complications being the driving point of being there, though again this varies from community to community in terms of what level of modern hospital care is accepted. And cost is also always a factor, given the Amish won't get medical insurance, and most of them live in the United States, where a hospital visit may just result in you needing to take a second mortgage out on your home. That said, given the community and family support one another, if a given person does require expensive medical care for some reason but can't afford it, this is accomplished via the community banding together and pitching in to help pay for such. Similarly, in the case of some disaster, the community will pool resources to help give a family or group of families enough money to rebuild, as well as provide the labor to do that, with arguably the most famous representation of this being barn raising. In these, the men of the community get together and rapidly erect the barn, while the women go about making the food to keep the men going on the long days of hard work to make it all happen. Speaking of babies, given that the size of the Amish populace about a century ago, as mentioned, was only about 5,000 individuals, and today is approaching 400,000 and still growing fast without much in the way of new blood added, though this is actually possible if you'd like to join an Amish community, which we'll get to in a bit, you might at this point be wondering about inbreeding and its effects on the Amish. Well, first we should note that some new blood does get introduced in the more wild of the Rumspringer, with teen girls occasionally finding themselves pregnant from an outsider. If you're wondering how the Amish handle this, or really any premarital pregnancy, regardless of who the father is, it's typical for the girl in question to promptly announce she's chosen to join the church officially, get baptized, and then, as quickly as possible, get married to give some semblance of the appearance that she isn't a whore of Babylon and in need of a good shunning. But as for the more common case and choosing a baby-making partner via marriage, the Amish have some pretty hard rules about marrying too close of a relation, with it typically not allowing anything closer than second cousin marriages. That said, in most cases, all Amish are pretty closely related, and this does cause some level of issues, though also has some benefits. You see, contrary to popular belief, inbreeding, even closely, isn't always a bad thing from an evolutionary standpoint. Just like bad genetic factors can often manifest in negative ways, good genetic qualities can do the same. And even in theory, over a long enough time, the bad genes may just work themselves out from those individuals sort of dying out while the positive ones dominate. Thus, long enough inbreeding with the right starter stock can actually be a boon. And we see all sides of this within Amish communities. For example, according to a study done by Northwestern University, the Amish they studied had an almost universal presence of a gene that has been associated with an average lifespan of about 10% longer for those that have it. The gene in question also has been linked to a number of other positive health factors like better insulin levels, blood pressure, and the like, which has been hypothesized to be why, in part, Amish life expectancy, even in communities without as robust modern medical care, is always so good. Of course, other factors are probably helping out here as well, like how much more physical exercise the Amish get. For example, one study by the American College of Sports Medicine in 2004 showed the average Amish male in the study took 18,425 steps each day, and the average female 14,196. As you might imagine from all of this, obesity among the Amish is almost non-existent at a rate of only about 4%, which also comes with all manner of health benefits. It's also noted that the Amish have much lower cancer rates for various reasons, with, for example, much lower skin cancer rates despite historically working long hours outside, attributed to their clothing and hats covering up most of their skin. That said, there are also downsides to this level of inbreeding, with certain things Amish communities experience higher rates of than the general populace of the regions around them, such as various metabolic disorders, dwarfism, and the like. However, while the Amish do know why this happens and that they'd benefit from some new blood, they don't really get too bothered about it and simply accept it as God's will. And speaking of Amish tending to live long lives, while they do eventually often retire from their normal profession at some point, as long as possible and in what ways as possible, they still help out where they can with the rest of their family in terms of doing various tasks and remaining a valuable contributor to their family and community. On top of that, ending up in a nursing home or the like, even for the ones that become unable to take care of themselves, is an extreme rarity, which goes back to a strong sense of community and family taking care of one another without outside help. This is exactly what they do here, with the younger generations caring for the old in whatever way they need, no matter how infirm they may get. And as for the elderly supporting themselves financially, this is once again done by the family and community. Going back to taxes, we should also point out that the Amish have been, since the 1960s, exempt from having to pay Social Security simply because even before, when they were required to pay it, they'd never accept it in their old age. In any event, one thing we've alluded to many times over the course of this piece is the act of shunning, and that the Amish tend to have very strict rules for their community members, with guidelines for everything from hat brim width to haircut to what technology one is allowed to use or not, with there being a surprising amount of variety in all of this from community to community. So, what exactly is shunning? Well, as ever, exactly what this involves varies from community to community, but in a nutshell, this is a form of ostracizing a community member for doing something that wasn't up to the standards of behavior or rules as outlined within that community. This wouldn't be leveled against someone lightly. It's more of a form of punishment when all other avenues of getting the person to correct their behavior or whatever the community doesn't like have been exhausted, after which, if they still persist in their ways, they may be shunned. During a shunning, other Amish will no longer aid you as before in anything, or eat at the same table as community community members. Communication may also be severely restricted, if allowed at all. Essentially, you're in all respects no longer a member of the community during your shunning because your behavior does not line up with community standards and you have refused to change your ways after repeated warnings. Thus, you've been voted off the island, so to speak, and must remain so until you repent and change your ways. Essentially, sort of an extreme timeout for adults, which may end up being permanent if the person doesn't conform to what the community wants. While all of this might seem like a rather quaint punishment, consider how this must be from the perspective of someone raised with an extremely strong sense of community and belonging within that, suddenly being without all that support or social contact, and it can no doubt be rather traumatic, let alone the certainty that if you don't change, burning in hell is your ultimate reward. As for what offences might get you such punishment, this includes all manner of things similar to things that non-Amish wouldn't exactly be wild about from peers, though perhaps a little more rigidly controlled by the group, given the strong sense of community cohesiveness amongst the Amish. As for more specific things that are a little more distinct to the Amish, for example, if you were discovered using some technology the community doesn't normally allow, or perhaps in a way not allowed even if technology is otherwise accepted. This could include something like a cell phone, which may in your community be allowed at your place of business, but not allowed in your home. Now, at this point you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, do Amish people use cell phones? I thought they hadn't paid their phone bill in 300 years. And the answer to that is, it's complicated. So now let's discuss the Amish and technology and the many misconceptions people have about it. Contrary to popular belief, the Amish are not really anti-technology or strictly stuck in the past. Rather, it's more accurate to say they are much more thoughtful and deliberate about technology than the rest of us, who more tend to dive right into new technological toys that other humans create without really thinking about how it might positively or negatively impact our lives and community. For the Amish, every new piece of technology, and even the pieces of technology that have been around for a while, are weighed in terms of their effects on the community and the Amish life and religion. If a technology is disruptive to the community or separates them in some way or seem to contribute things that are contrary to Amish ideals, this technology would typically be rejected. That said, it may be the case that it's not rejected universally simply for certain environments or scenarios, with the home itself guarded most closely. And we should point out here that different Amish communities vary pretty drastically on what technologies are incorporated and how. But as an example, one unnamed Amish man uses as part of his business a propane-powered forklift, hydraulic-powered saws, certain cordless power tools, etc., and even has a phone with voicemail that he uses regularly. Yet another Amish business owner named Stephen even has a website for his business and uses a computer and spreadsheet software to help manage his company. Even outside of business, some of the more liberal Amish communities allow a community computer with access to email, just not allowed in the home itself, and generally purchasing a computer with its software set up specifically for Amish sensibilities, not allowing things like the general internet, video, or music. Even for communities not so liberal to allow a community computer, most do have a community phone and voicemail. Just once again, you aren't likely to find this inside an Amish home. That said, it's incredibly easy to hide a cell phone with full internet access, and all of it something that community leaders lament, particularly when it comes to youths who may be less strictly adhering to community rules because teens are going to teen. In some Amish communities and businesses, power tools are also widely used, just usually as alluded to, of the air or hydraulic-powered variety rather than electric. They also may hire, for example, non-Amish individuals to haul their product or supplies around in their vehicles, do their accounting, and perform all manner of tasks using modern technology that the Amish may not be allowed to use. That said, some communities are far more restrictive on technology use, even in business. It just depends on the community and what it's going to be used for. For example, one Amish man named Ben, who owns a deli, states that he still chooses to do his bookkeeping by hand, and that, quote, "I would really love to have QuickBooks because it's a pain to balance my checkbook, but that the use of a computer is a big decision, and that he generally lives by the policy of that you shouldn't be the first in your neighborhood to adopt the new technology, and neither should you be the last." Speaking of computers, also contrary to popular belief, the Amish don't necessarily shun fancy things like electricity. If whatever is using that electricity is deemed a benefit to the community and not something that detracts and otherwise does not hinder or violate any core tenets of their beliefs, it may be a good candidate to be at least experimented with to see the effects it has once partially adopted, and if all good, after officially allowed to be used in specific ways. Just with electricity, you aren't likely to find an Amish community willing to be tied to the main power grid, as this sort of violates the goal of remaining apart. As Professor Donald Craybill and author of The Amish notes, they don't want to get too engaged and too embedded in this world because you may lose your ultimate eternal goal of completing the journey to heaven. However, having solar panels and battery systems to be used in very specific ways is something many communities do have, just probably not hooked up to your home. And when looking at things like transportation, while you won't find an Amish person owning a car, outside of perhaps rare communities potentially allowing one of their youths during their Rumspringer to have such, they are in most cases happy to utilize cars and buses and even trains and ships in specific scenarios. One account we read even discussed a newly wedded Amish couple who went on a cruise for a sort of honeymoon. The key facet here is that unlike cars, these forms of mass transport are not typically used for personal status or prestige and not owned by the Amish. The Amish youth also typically may use non-motorized scooters to get around, although interestingly, bicycles are usually a no-go in most communities, owing to them being a little too easy for youths to venture away from the community on relatively quickly. This is sort of an extension of not really allowing car ownership, as it's generally seen as too easy for the community to then go too far afield anytime they want. A horse and buggy for things reasonably close by, and allowing hiring others to drive is a bit of a practical compromise for adults, and non-motorized scooter is considered something of a practical compromise for kids versus a bicycle. Planes, however, are generally considered a no-go, deemed an unnecessary extravagance. That said, even here there are exceptions for certain uses, with some communities still allowing air travel in the case of, for example, a medical emergency where someone needs to be airlifted to a hospital. The overarching point in all of this is, once again, it's not so much that most Amish people are anti-technology or universally against anything the modern world has to offer. They are just extremely deliberate and thoughtful about what they allow and how they allow it for a given scenario to make sure that it's going to be a benefit to the community and their faith. That said, despite the accelerated adoption of technology among the Amish in recent times, they still, on the whole, do practice a much simpler way of life from our perspective, something that appeals to many longing for the days of yore. Now, if you've followed literally any of our work for more than a few weeks, one thing you're going to find very clear is that unequivocally we're of the opinion that the past was the worst, despite what many people with rose-coloured glasses constantly espouse. All this really does is show that the person really needs to crack a history book or read an in-depth report about what life was really like in the past. Not just necessarily even talking major events, but just what day-to-day life was really like. Yes, there are specific exceptions throughout human history of this or that which may have been nicer from your perspective, or perhaps even a universal perspective, but we're speaking in generalities. Have cancer or basically any health ailment? No time better to be alive than today, except maybe tomorrow. Are you literally anything but a white heterosexual male in the Western world? Well, good luck in the past, have fun with that one. Are a white heterosexual male in the Western world even a king? Well, yeah, good luck with that too. A modern middle class person has it better in most ways in day-to-day life and is likely to live a lot longer, with countless nicer aspects of life just being nicer. Turns out there's just something nice about being able to drink a glass of milk and not get tuberculosis directly after, and not having half your children die before adulthood. That said, in some respects, the Amish have found a balance of this, keeping a lot of the good elements of the past while incorporating some of the good elements of the now, and in ways to help ensure that they're a positive impact on your life. However, even that's a rose-coloured glasses view, as in reality, unless your thing is waking up at 4:30 in the morning to milk your cows, milking and ploughing so long that even Ezekiel thinks that your mind is gone, or you enjoy the traditional role of men and women in the home and all that jazz, and like having the community decide literally every facet of acceptable behaviour for you right down to the exact clothing you're allowed to wear, and watching and critiquing you and you them 24/7, then you're probably not going to enjoy being Amish. Again, the Amish are pretty incredibly strict on a number of things, especially once you become a full adult member of the community after baptism. It's your community's way, or quite literally the highway, and don't like it? Well, leave and never come back. That said, this type of life and religion can still be appealing to some, and in fact, some even choose to leave behind modern life and join the Amish despite not being born into it. So if you think you're really righteous, and think you're pure of heart, and would like to spend most of your life living in an Amish paradise, how would you go about joining them? Well, for starters, you should know that it's not easy, and not all communities are going to be so inviting. A rather unique thing about the Amish faith among Christian sects is that they aren't out there evangelizing and trying to get everyone to join up. They prefer to simply set an example by their work and lifestyle, but otherwise keep to themselves. But some communities do allow outsiders to attempt to join, and if it's your thing, one of the first things you're going to need to do is learn Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, a bit of a misnomer, this is not actually Dutch, but an offshoot of German, with it often called Dutch simply from people mispronouncing the original Pennsylvania Deutsch, as in German. But as for the Amish, while the Amish do learn English in school and speak it when talking to outsiders, internally most communities use Pennsylvania Dutch when talking amongst each other, and High German during worship services and in their Bibles. Thus, if you want to be Amish, you'll need to learn these languages. When joining the Amish, you're also going to need to be indoctrinated into the often extremely strict rules and ways of living within a certain certain community, which again varies from community to community. On this, it's going to take a while to pick up on everything and adjust your behavior and the things you talk about and don't talk about, and even the way that you talk about certain things. In the end, if you accomplish all of this and become the pious guy the amulets want to be like, showing yourself to be an outstanding member of the community over an extended period and enjoying the day-to-day life and lifestyle of the community, you may be allowed to be baptized into it and otherwise become a fully fledged Amish, although depending on the exact community, you may still be considered something of an outsider for many years. But the point is, if you're willing to put in the work and don't mind the restrictions and the like, it is possible to join, just it's not very commonly achieved even by those that do try. And while many elements of Amish life are very appealing to some, particularly if sick of the modern rat race and the life of humans, there are an awful lot of elements that aren't so easy to adapt to for those not raised with these certain beliefs and rules. And even within the Amish community, you still need to make a living and generally need to work extremely hard as ever. Again, as the Great One summed up, it's hard work and sacrifice living in an Amish paradise. In the end, what most people looking to the Amish are often really doing here is just longing for our collective, seemingly idyllic past of a much simpler life and projecting that onto Amish society and idealizing it. Except, just like that supposed idyllic past, this version of Amish culture doesn't really exist, with reality being a lot more complex and nuanced and something most today would not enjoy living in. As the aforementioned former Amish man Ira Wagler states, people put the Amish on a pedestal, but they are just people. He goes on, my childhood had great security, with black and white boundaries and a very warm community. It was on a farm, so we worked and played, out in the fields or fishing in the creeks. I have very warm memories. However, the dark side of this, he states, is it is mind control. You knew that if you stepped outside the culture, you'd go to hell. It was only in my mid-20s that I realized you don't have to be Amish. Another former Amishman notes, though there are good things about growing up Amish, I would never go back to being Amish. And the biggest reason for this is because of religious bondage. It may appear as though they live a quiet and peaceful life that's free from the cares of this world, but the fact is they cannot escape the stresses of life and the struggle of trying to make a living for their large families. And their lives are not easy, because they believe they have to live this way to please God. Sadly, whenever man sets out to please God by what he does or doesn't do, he's living in bondage. That's not to say the Amish don't have a number of extremely admirable qualities to their general culture and people, as we outlined. Just, you don't need to be Amish to adopt many of these things. Like, think your cell phone is ruling your life, make the choice to turn it off and add structure to when and how you're allowed to use it. Essentially start by mimicking our Amish friends and being more deliberate about what and even who you allow into your life and what you cut out. Love their sense of family and loyalty to it? Well, spend more time with your own. Well, do you really think all Amish people like all their family members or community members? Or maybe do they just choose to stick together and have each other's backs despite this? Granted, you may have this mindset as well, and your family not, so unable to develop this within your family. But the point is, for many, it's a choice not to be deeply involved with family and in your community. If you want this, especially on the community level, it can usually be found if you're willing to put in the effort, just like the Amish do. The list goes on, but the overarching point being, in some ways, the reality of being Amish is a simpler life, particularly as many personal choices are taken from you, which has its pros and cons. But in a lot of ways, the life of an Amish is also a lot more complicated and certainly vastly more controlled. Some may prefer all of this, the types of work, the extreme structure and rigid rules, the strict religious aspects of it all. And for those who do, more power to you. There really are a lot of positives about Amish culture we could all stand to learn from, but given how few people from the outside world choose to try and become Amish, and even fewer who actually succeed, let's just say we're guessing, much like if most who pine to live in the days of yore were actually granted their wish, most would immediately regret this decision. In the case of the rose-coloured past lovers, probably about the time they have to take a crap and realise toilet paper without splinters wasn't a thing until about a century ago. And will have fun with approximately 1/3 of your children dying as a baby and half not making it to adulthood, which, as mentioned, was the norm in recorded history up until a little over a century ago. The past was the worst. In the end, though, while you'd probably think it bites living in an Amish paradise, we can all probably benefit from taking a leaf out of the Amish book and be more deliberate about our lives and what and who we allow in or not. And instead of pining for the elements of the past we like, maybe doing something about actually making it our reality, while still keeping the elements of modern life that are positive to us. From the dawn of history, we humans have been obsessed with measurement, striving to gauge, rank, and quantify every part of our world, from the tallest mountain to the tiniest grain of sand. It is an obsession which led to the development of the precise mathematics and science which underpin our modern world. But one unfortunate result of this millennia-long quest has been to saddle us with a bewildering array of disparate weights and measures, many of which, to modern eyes, appear completely arbitrary and illogical. Much of this apparent arbitrariness stems from these systems of measurement having been created in an era before precise measuring instruments, when people had to rely on everyday objects and observations to make sense of their world. For example, the mile, now defined as 5,280 feet, or 1,609.344 meters, derives its name from the Latin word for 1,000, and once corresponded to 1,000 standard paces of a marching Roman soldier. Similarly, the acre, now defined as 43,560 square feet, or 4,047 square meters, was traditionally the average area of land which could be ploughed by a team of oxen in one day. Slightly more modern but equally based in everyday agrarian life is horsepower, developed by engineer James Watt in the late 18th century to measure the output of steam engines. Defined today as 745.7 watts, 1 horsepower originally referred to the mechanical power needed by a draft horse to lift a 550-pound weight a distance of 1 foot over 1 second. Essentially, Watt wanted a way to show people how economical it would be to replace their draft horses with his engines. It isn't known exactly how he came up with the numbers he did, as there are conflicting accounts of the experiments he ran. And in truth, that's a very generous estimate, as very few horses could maintain that kind of power for a full workday, but getting a perfect figure wasn't important to what Watt was trying to do. Further, by overestimating what a horse could do, whether intentionally or not, he made sure that his product would always overdeliver what he said when trying to get people to buy it, which is a great word-of-mouth marketing trick. Moving on from there, other common systems of measurement are baffling on an entirely different level, and one of the most widespread and confusing is the concept of gauge. While the term originates from the use of a standardized measuring tool, or gauge for inspection, the various measurement systems known as gauge are as different as the objects they measure. The most common use of gauge is to measure the thickness of sheet metal and the diameter of metal wire. The gauge scale works opposite to what one might expect, with one gauge measuring 0.28 inches thick, but a 10-gauge sheet being only 0.14 inches. Similarly, 1-gauge wire measures 0.3 inches in diameter and 10-gauge wire is 0.128. This system, however, starts to make a lot more sense when you consider how these metals are actually manufactured. Sheet metal is produced by passing thick sheet steel through heavy rollers, while wire is manufactured by pulling metal rods through a draw plate, a hardened metal die with a series of precise holes drilled in it. The gauge refers to the number of times a sheet is passed through the rollers, or a wire through the draw plate, with the metal getting progressively thinner with each pass. Thus, the higher the gauge, the thinner the metal. Originally, the exact thickness of each gauge number was based on the standard thickness of the original or zero gauge starting material, 0.2813 inches for sheet metal and 0.324 inches for wire. Later, smaller gauge numbers written as 2/0, 3/0, and 4/0, and so on were added to accommodate thicker materials. Nowadays, however, sheet metal and wire are typically measured by simple thickness or diameter in millimeters or fractions of an inch, while the gauge systems still in use have been rationalized to make them more consistent. For example, in the British Standard Wire Gauge, or SWG system introduced in 1883, wire sizes are fitted to a pre-calculated exponential curve wherein the weight per unit length changes by 20% per step. This, in turn, means that the wire diameter decreases by approximately 10.6% between gauge numbers. Gauge is also used to measure hollow tubes, though in this case gauge refers not to the diameter of the tube, but rather its wall thickness. As in other gauge systems, the higher the gauge number, the thinner the tube walls. This again derives from the manufacturing process, with the walls getting thinner each time a tube is drawn through a tool called a swage. In industry, tube dimensions are typically given as a combination of outer diameter and gauge. However, this applies only to larger structural tube sizes. In the Birmingham gauge system commonly used for hypodermic needles, gauge numbers refer not to wall thickness alone, but rather to a standardized combination of outer diameter and wall thickness. Wall thickness also does not consistently decrease with diameter, with some higher gauges actually having thicker walls than lower gauges. The Birmingham scale ranges from 0.0000 gauge with a diameter of half an inch down to 36 gauge with a diameter of 0.003 inches, with 19 to 26 gauge being the most common common diameters for hypodermic needles. Further adding to the confusion, intravenous catheters, though inserted using hypodermic needles, are measured using an entirely different system called French gauge. Unlike in Birmingham gauge, a higher French gauge number indicates a thicker catheter, with the numbers corresponding to 3 times the diameter of the catheter tube in millimeters. Thus, a 3 French gauge tube has an outer diameter of 1 millimeter. And if all of this wasn't enough, gauge only applies to seamless drawn tubing. For welded pipes and those used to carry water and sewage, yet another system known as pipe schedule is used. Each standard pipe size is available in up to 11 standard pipe schedules ranging from 5 to 160, each defined by a particular ratio between the internal pressure of the pipe and maximum allowable stress in the pipe wall. Thus, as schedule increases, so does the thickness of the pipe wall compared to its outer diameter, meaning that the higher the schedule, the more internal pressure a pipe can carry. But as pipe schedule is based on calculations of mechanical stress, the ratio between pipe thickness and pipe diameter is not constant across each schedule. For example, for a 1-inch schedule 30 pipe, the ratio is 13.5%, while for a 3-inch schedule 30 pipe, it is only 5%. Thus, in most practical applications, it is easier to look up the dimensions of a particular pipe size on a standard chart rather than calculate it. Yet another way in which gauge is commonly used is to measure the barrel diameter or bore of firearms, particularly shotguns. As in other gauge systems, the higher the gauge, the smaller the diameter, with a 16-gauge barrel, for instance, being smaller than a 12-gauge barrel. However, unlike with sheet metal, wire, or tubing, this system is based not on the manufacturing process of the barrel, but a totally different and archaic system involving lead, the metal traditionally used to make shotgun projectiles. If you were to take a pound of lead, divide it into 12 equal pieces, and form these pieces into perfect spheres, each of those spheres would have a diameter of 0.729 inches or 18.53 millimeters, the exact inner diameter of a 12-gauge shotgun barrel. Thus, shotgun gauge refers to the number of pieces into which that pound of lead is divided. The higher the number, the smaller the resulting spheres, and the smaller the barrel diameter. The only common exception to this is the 410 gauge, commonly used for hunting small game like rabbits or grouse. In this case, 410 is not actually a gauge, but simply the caliber or internal diameter of the barrel in inches. But while the gauge is used to measure the diameter of the barrel, the actual pellets or shot fired by a shotgun are measured using an entirely different system. As with gauge, a higher number corresponds to a smaller pellet diameter, but as there are multiple different classification systems still in use, things get very confusing very quickly. In the British system, shot is classified according to the number of pellets per ounce, with, for example, AAA shot corresponding to 35 pellets per ounce, A shot 50 pellets per ounce, double B shot 72 pellets per ounce, and number 2 shot 87 pellets per ounce. The American and European systems are similar, but differ in the actual diameter of each shot type, the American system being based on hundredths of an inch and the European system on millimeters, with each number corresponding to a 0.25 millimeter decrease in diameter. This system, incidentally, is the origin of the BBs traditionally used in children's BB guns. BB in this case does not stand for ball bearing, as is sometimes claimed, but rather BB-sized shot, once defined as 0.180 inches, but now standardized at 0.177 inches or 4.5 millimeters. Buckshot used against larger game is measured using a similar, but again, slightly different system. As with birdshot, the British system is based on shot weight, with SG or small game shot corresponding to 8 pellets per ounce. Each subsequent size designated as SSG, SSSG, and so on is half the weight of the last. The American system is centered around number 0 buck, with larger pellets designated by additional zeros, as in the ubiquitous double-aught buck, and smaller pellets by larger numbers like number 1 buck, number 2 buck, and so on. These sizes in turn correspond to an increase of approximately 2 to 3 pellets per ounce. However, given the long and complex history of these measures and the inexact methods used to create them, most of these sizes are more a matter of tradition than any rational system. And finally, we come to the last common use of gauge, as a measure of the width of railroad tracks. Unlike other gauge-based systems, railroad gauge is not based on any overarching system of measurement, but rather evolved over time to meet the ever-changing needs of railway rolling stock. The earliest common track gauge of around 4 feet 4 inches was based on the width of the wagons and horse teams used to haul coal and other minerals out of mines. But as steam locomotives continued to grow, so too did track gauge. What is now known as standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches was first used on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830, while the broad gauge of 7 feet 1/4 inch was first used on the Great Western Railway in 1833 to give trains greater lateral stability. However, the use of different gauges on competing rail lines led to massive compatibility problems within the British rail system, and in 1846 the regulating gauge Gauge of Railways Act mandated that all lines be converted to standard gauge. Today, standard gauge is the most commonly used railway gauge in the world, though broad gauge, defined as any gauge significantly wider than 4 feet 8.5 inches, is still widely used in India and Russia, while narrow gauge is still used in parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, Central and South America, and in industrial settings like mines and factory complexes. And so we reach the end of our journey through the arcane and confusing world of gauge. After all that, all I can say is, I for one welcome our metric overlords. If your parents ever took you to a science museum or planetarium as a child, you likely spent much of your visit in the gift shop, begging them to buy you one of the hundreds of shiny and purportedly educational items on offer. And most irresistible of all was undoubtedly astronaut food. Shiny foil packets of freeze-dried strawberries or ice cream sandwiches. Sure, they had the texture of a florist's foam crumbled into sticky dust and tasted like sugary chalk, but that didn't matter. You were eating the same food as actual astronauts. Well, we're sorry to ruin your cherished childhood memories, but sadly no, you weren't. For while the freeze-drying process used to make these novel treats was originally developed for the space program, no astronaut has ever eaten gift shop astronaut strawberries or ice cream during a mission, for the simple reason that the crumbs would float away and wreak havoc in the spacecraft. So, what do astronauts actually eat in orbit? Well, put on your spacesuit and pack your tang as we blast off into the long and complicated and, well, fascinating story of space food. Before the first humans were blasted into the final frontier in the early 1960s, many scientists questioned whether astronauts could even eat in space. After all, the human body has evolved to function on Earth. Would microgravity, they wondered, interfere with swallowing or digestion, causing an astronaut to choke or develop intestinal problems? There were also more practical concerns, which have informed the development of space food ever since. First, food's heavy, a serious problem when each kilo of mass costs thousands of dollars to loft into orbit. Second, in microgravity, liquids do not flow like they do on Earth, making regular drinking vessels useless. And finally, loose food crumbs floating around the spacecraft cabin could potentially be breathed in by an astronaut, get in their eyes, or short out electrical circuitry. For these reasons, when Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth on April 12, 1961, he carried with him 3 160-gram toothpaste-style food tubes containing either pureed meat or chocolate sauce. To his and everyone else's relief, Gagarin had no trouble swallowing and digesting the food. Indeed, food is largely passed through the digestive system by peristalsis, the rhythmic contraction of the esophageal and intestinal walls, a process that works perfectly well in microgravity. However, as the Soviets would soon learn, there are many other challenges to humans living and working in space. For example, during the Vostok 2 mission, launched on August 6, 1961, German Titov became the first to experience something that would plague countless future astronauts and their flight surgeons, the combination of disorientation, dizziness, and nausea known as space adaptation syndrome, or simply space sickness. By contrast, the first 2 American space flights, Mercury Redstone 3 and 4, were only 15-minute suborbital hops, so the astronauts, Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom, carried no food with them. Indeed, to ensure the astronauts would not be distracted by the urge to defecate, they were made to eat an all-protein, low-residue breakfast of steak and eggs prior to launch, a practice which has since become a cherished NASA tradition. The first American to eat in space was John Glenn, who orbited the Earth aboard Mercury Atlas 6 on February 20th, 1962. Much like Gagarin, Glenn was provided with metal squeeze tubes filled with apple sauce or a mixture of pureed beef, vegetables, and gravy. While Glenn did have some applesauce and sugar tablets, he reported not being very hungry and did not otherwise eat during his 5-hour mission. However, he may have sampled a product which has since become inextricably associated with the space program, a certain orange-flavored drink called Tang. First introduced by General Foods Corporation in 1959, Tang initially sold poorly. The following year, however, the newly formed NASA selected the product for use in Project Mercury. The powder was packed in a plastic pouch into which the astronaut could inject water from the spacecraft's onboard supply. They then squeezed the pouch to mix the contents and drank it through an attached straw, the system that neatly got around the problems of liquids in microgravity and is still used to this day. While NASA was careful to avoid product placement by labeling the pouches simply as orange drink, General Foods eagerly capitalized on its association with the space program, advertising Tang as the drink of astronauts. As expected, sales shot through the roof. But while Tang was on the menu of several Gemini, Apollo, and Space Shuttle missions, not all astronauts were big fans. As Glenn later explains, on the ground, we liked the sweet fruit juices, such as mango. In orbit, we generally found them too sweet. This observation touched on a strange phenomenon experienced by many astronauts. Long-term exposure to microgravity significantly affects one's sense of taste. Other astronauts were less nuanced, with Buzz Aldrin, Apollo 11 lunar module pilot, once stating, "Tang sucks," and explaining in his 1970 autobiography autobiography, "I can't speak for the other flights, but before, the three of us dutifully sampled the orange drink, supposedly Tang, and instead chose a grapefruit-orange mixture as our citrus drink. If Tang was on our flight, I was unaware of it." The Mercury astronauts were also less than enthusiastic about sucking down food from tubes. Not only could the food not be seen or smelled prior to eating, but the delivery system limited the variety and texture of food that could be served. Consequently, on his May 24, 1962 Mercury Atlas 7 mission, Malcolm Scott Carpenter became the first astronaut to eat solid food in orbit. Developed in partnership with the Pillsbury Corporation, this food consisted of bite-sized cubes of compressed dates, cereals, and chocolate with a special gelatin coating to prevent them from crumbling. Unfortunately, the cubes accidentally got crushed prior to launch, cracking the coating and creating crumbs which soon began drifting around the cabin. Wary that these crumbs posed an inhalation hazard, Carpenter quickly put the food away. High cabin temperatures also caused the supplied chocolate bars to melt in their packages, meaning that other than the water and Xylo's sugar pill, Carpenter ate nothing for the rest of the mission. NASA next experimented with freeze-dried food. Developed by the Whirlpool Corporation, freeze-drying, or lyophilization, involves flash-freezing food and subjecting it to a hard vacuum. This causes the ice in the food to sublimate, that is, transition directly from solid to gas, leaving the structure and taste of the food intact while rendering it much lighter and resistant to spoilage. All the astronaut has to do is inject water into the packaging to rehydrate the food and restore it to its original state. However, the water supply aboard the Mercury spacecraft was unheated, meaning astronauts experienced difficulties in rehydrating their meals. By the time of the final 34-hour Mercury Atlas 9 mission on May 15, 1963, the situation had improved somewhat, with astronaut Leroy Gordon Cooper eating a meal of dehydrated shrimp, potato salad, and apple juice. Following the flight, however, Cooper remarked that, "I think the food I had along was adequate, although it was so much work to get some of it here that I tended just to perhaps not eat as much as I should have." As NASA transitioned from Project Mercury to the much more ambitious projects Gemini and Apollo, it became clear that space food technology needed serious improvement. A round-trip flight to the moon could take 2 weeks, making astronauts' long-term nutrition a much greater priority. However, keeping astronauts properly fed and their morale high would be difficult if they found their food unpalatable. By the time the first Gemini missions were launched in 1965, NASA food scientists had created an extensive meal of dehydrated items including fruit, salad, stewed meat, soup, cereal cubes, bacon cubes, toast squares, butterscotch pudding, and sandwiches from which astronauts could assemble their daily meals. Shrimp cocktail, consisting of freeze-dried shrimp and powdered cocktail sauce, proved especially popular with Gemini and Apollo astronauts, with many selecting it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. As Buzz Aldrin later raved, they were chosen one by one to make sure they would be tiny enough to squeeze out of the food packet, and they were delicious. The design of the Gemini spacecraft made freeze-dried foods a logical choice. Unlike Mercury, which used batteries, Gemini was powered by hydrogen fuel cells, which produced water as a byproduct. The astronauts thus had plenty of water with which to rehydrate their meals, which was injected into the food packets using a special squirt gun. However, this water was still unheated, meaning the food often took a long time to properly rehydrate. These shortcomings led Gemini astronauts to pine for proper terrestrial food, leading to one of the most infamous incidents in the early space program. On the 23rd of March, 1965, the first Gemini mission, Gemini 3 blasted off from Cape Canaveral, carrying astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young into orbit. As a surprise treat for his commander, Young smuggled aboard a corned beef sandwich purchased at Wolf's Restaurant in Cocoa Beach, Florida. This violated several NASA regulations. Not only could the sandwich release potentially troublesome crumbs, but as part of a biomedical study, Grissom was not authorized to eat any food during the 5-hour mission. Thus, while delighted with the gift, Grissom only took a few bites before stowing the contraband sandwich away. Grissom and Young were later rebuked for the incident, which resulted in a congressional hearing, and NASA Administrator George Mueller promising to clamp down on what astronauts were allowed to bring on missions. While Gemini astronauts generally enjoyed their food selections, as missions grew longer and longer, they began encountering another problem: storage space. The cockpit of the Gemini spacecraft was roughly the size of the front seats of a Volkswagen Beetle, and into this space the astronauts had to cram the 1,800 cubic centimeters of food that each man would need for every day of the mission. Furthermore, they also had to somehow store the used food packages, as well as plastic bags of their own waste. On August 21st, 1965, Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad blasted off into orbit aboard Gemini 5, an 8-day endurance mission meant to test the limits of the Gemini spacecraft and its occupants. As the mission wore on, the astronauts quickly ran out of storage space and were forced to stuff waste bags into every available corner, leading Cooper to describe the mission as 8 days in a garbage can. 4 months later, Frank Borman and Jim Lovell would encounter similar problems during the Gemini 7 mission, a grueling 14-day ordeal designed to simulate a round trip to the moon. The Apollo lunar program saw some of the most significant advances courses in space food technology, many of which were developed by the US Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine in Dayton, Ohio, and the Natick Army Labs in Massachusetts. One major upgrade to the Apollo spacecraft compared to Gemini was the provision of a hot water supply, which made freeze-dried food easier to rehydrate and the resulting product more palatable. But while these meals were designed to be squeezed from their packets through a narrow opening, astronauts soon took to cutting the bags open and eating the contents with a regular spoon to more closely approximate a regular culinary experience. In light of this practice, NASA soon developed the spoon bowl, first introduced on the Apollo 10 mission in May 1969. This consisted of a plastic food bag with a water injection valve at the bottom and a zip closure at the top, which could be opened to access the contents. These meals had to be specially formulated to stick together and not float out of the bag, but were much appreciated by the astronauts as they allowed a greater variety of food to be served. Once empty, these food packs were injected with a special germicide to prevent spoilage before being stored away for the rest of the mission. Another major development introduced for Apollo was the wet pack, wherein regular food items like hot dogs, spaghetti and meatballs, and pot roast were stabilized by heating them to an extremely high temperature, a method similar to milk pasteurization. While heavier than dehydrated food, the increase in flavor and morale was seen as worth the weight penalty. Indeed, maximizing flavor is a key consideration in formulating space food since, as mentioned before, microgravity can reduce astronauts' taste sensitivity by up to 30%. This is thought to be caused by fluid building up in the head, leading to sinus congestion that dulls the senses just like a bad head cold. Furthermore, to avoid irritating astronauts' digestion, Apollo-era space food was made with as few spices as possible. For this reason, salty or umami-rich foods like bacon cubes or the aforementioned shrimp cocktail became perennial favorites. Wet packs also allowed for a variety of food items to be carried on missions. For example, as they orbited the moon on Christmas Eve 1968, the crew of Apollo 8 dined on thermostabilized packets of turkey and gravy and even fruitcake. And at the astronauts' request, Apollo 10 introduced a pantry system wherein they could select, mix and match various food items as they pleased. In practice, however, this proved more trouble than it was worth, and most Apollo astronauts stuck to the pre-packaged meals that they had selected before launch. Subsequent missions introduced even more menu options, such as thermally stabilized cheddar on Apollo 11, dehydrated natural orange juice on Apollo 13, and even fresh sliced bread on Apollo 15. These slices were sterilized by exposure to 50,000 rads of cobalt-60 gamma radiation and allowed the crew to create their own sandwiches using meat salad spreads stored in pull-top metal cans. Many of these innovations were developed under the leadership of physiologist Rita Rapp, who headed NASA's Apollo Food System team. One of the first women to study medicine at St. Louis University School of Medicine, Rapp made many important contributions to space food technology, including her homemade sugar cookies, which became so popular among the astronauts that they became an informal currency aboard the Skylab space station. As astronauts started spending more and more time on the lunar surface, NASA realized they needed a means of staying fed and hydrated while they worked. Thus, for Apollo 15, the commander and lunar module pilots' EVA suits were modified to hold a special water bag under the helmet ring, which the astronaut could drink from using a tube. The device also featured cloth pockets to hold long, high-density energy bars. Developed by Pillsbury, the same company who created the food cubes for Mercury Atlas 7, these bars would later be marketed on Earth as space food sticks and later just food sticks and would remain on grocery store shelves until the 1980s. The Pillsbury bars also formed part of the contingency food system, which allowed astronauts to eat and drink with their spacesuits in the event the spacecraft cabin became depressurized. This consisted of a small port in the side of the helmet through which drink packet straws or food sticks could be inserted. Thankfully, no Apollo astronaut has ever had to use this system. Also worth noting here is that the first meal eaten on another world was a host wafer and wine consumed when Buzz Aldrin took communion shortly after landing on the lunar surface, and for more on this, please do check out our previous video, Space Religion. Other improvements to the Apollo food system included the addition of extra potassium to drink powder, implemented after heart monitor data from Apollo 15 revealed heart arrhythmias throughout to be caused by potassium deficiency. But while the Apollo missions were some of the longest duration space flights yet, they paled in comparison to what was to come. As the United States and Soviet Union transitioned from simply visiting space to actually living there long-term, space food technology was forced to undergo another massive revolution. While NASA spent a great deal of time and effort trying to make its astronauts' culinary experience as familiar as possible, the Soviet space program took a rather utilitarian approach, retaining the squeeze tubes and other delivery systems that NASA had abandoned after Project Mercury. The cosmonauts menu, however, was distinctly Russian and included canned beef tongue, packaged Riga rye bread, and squeezed tubes of borscht and caviar. And when cosmonauts from other communist nations began flying aboard the Soyuz spacecraft as part of the Intercosmos program, they brought along their own specially prepared regional delicacies like Bulgarian sarma, stuffed grape leaves. During the Apollo-Soyuz test project in July 1975, in which a Soviet and American spacecraft docked in Earth orbit for 2 days, American astronauts Deke Slayton, Vance Brand, and Tom Stafford got to taste a selection of Soviet space food, including tubes of borscht onto which the cosmonauts had cheekily pasted vodka labels. With the launch of the world's first space station, the Soviet Salyut 1, in April 1971, space food technology made another giant leap, the station featuring a small greenhouse called Oasis. Due to technical issues, the greenhouse aboard Salyut 1 was never used, but by 1975, the crews of Salyut 4 were regularly eating fresh tomatoes, cucumbers, and coriander grown in orbit, and for the first time, they were allowed to consume small quantities of alcohol like wine and vodka with their meals. The first American space station, Skylab, was launched in May 1973 and had perhaps the most luxurious dining arrangements of any spacecraft before or since. Being significantly larger than previous spacecraft like Apollo, Skylab had room for a dedicated wardroom, including a dining table and chairs with foot and thigh restraints so the crew could sit down normally to eat. This arrangement was considered vital to maintaining crew morale and cohesion, and the table was even made triangular to avoid hierarchical seating positions. Much of the food aboard Skylab was similar to Apollo fare, packaged in metal peel-top cans and plastic pouches. However, the astronauts were also provided with special dining trays that could be clipped to the side of the dining table. These had 8 cylindrical wells to hold food tins, 3 of which could be electronically heated. The trays also featured a magnetic surface for holding cutlery or the scissors that were used to open the food packages. Some of this arrangement was out of pure necessity, as Skylab used solar panels instead of fuel cells to generate power. The supply of fresh water was limited, forcing planners to reduce the number of dehydrated food items on the menu. Skylab's greatest luxuries, however, were its onboard refrigerator and freezer, which allowed up to 15% of the astronauts' food to be perishable. The full Skylab menu consisted of 72 items, including such delicacies as chili, mashed potato, steak, asparagus, lobster Newburg, fresh bread, and yes, even ice cream. This would be the first and last time real ice cream would be eaten in space, for no spacecraft since Skylab, not even the Space Shuttle or International Space Station, has included a freezer. But I hear you ask, what about that freeze-dried ice cream? While this gift shop staple was developed at the request of the astronauts and included on the menu of the 1968 Apollo 7 mission, none of the crew remember having eaten it during the flight, and the reaction to freeze-dried ice cream was less than stellar, when NASA astronaut Mike Massimo once stating, "Freeze-dried ice cream is disgusting, more closely related to a building material than a food." For this reason, ice cream was left off the menus of all subsequent NASA missions except Skylab. Instead, the story of the museum treat loved by so many children begins not with NASA, but American Outdoor Products, a company specializing in food for hikers and backpackers. In the late 1970s, company founder Ron Smith received an unusual phone call from a subcontractor specializing in freeze drying. They said, Goddard Air and Space Museum contacted us and said that freeze-dried ice cream was used by the space program. They want to know if we can make it so they can sell it in their gift shop. And we said, sure, we'll try it. The first batch was half a gallon of Neapolitan ice cream that you would buy in the store. It was frozen solid and then cut with a bandsaw, if you can believe it. Though Smith was skeptical of the ice cream's appeal, it proved surprisingly popular with museum visitors and soon spread to hundreds of other institutions. To quote, "Quite frankly, when we first started doing this, we thought, well, this is a fad. It'll last a couple of years." And that was what? 44 years ago? And that, dear viewer, is how astronaut ice cream actually came to be. Sorry to ruin your childhood. Another culinary first attempted by the Skylab program was the introduction of alcohol to the US space program, in this case, cream sherry. However, before this stellar digestive could make it into orbit, NASA subjected it to simulated microgravity aboard an aircraft flying parabolic arcs, the so-called vomit comet. This test revealed that the smell of the sherry quickly permeated the cabin and induced nausea, prompting NASA to pull it from the flight. Instead, the astronauts consumed their supply on the ground with their pre-launch meal. Today, alcohol is forbidden aboard the International Space Station, not only because of the smell, but also its potential negative impacts on astronaut health and performance. Skylab was abandoned in February 1974 and deorbited in 1979, taking its palatial wardroom with it. Crews of the Space Shuttle Orbiter, which flew in 1981, would have to contend with slightly less luxurious dining arrangements. The small galley located on the orbiter's middeck incorporated a water dispenser for rehydrating freeze-dried food, and powdered drinks and an oven for reheating wet-packed meals. As on Skylab, food packages could be fastened to a tray, but with no table to sit around, these trays had to be strapped to the astronauts' laps and consumed wherever was convenient. But what the shuttle lacked in dining facilities, it more than made up for in the selection, with the full menu consisting of 74 different food items and 20 drinks. In 2006, the crew of Discovery even enjoyed a special menu developed by celebrity chef Emeril Lagasse, which included jambalaya and bread pudding. 20 years earlier, in 1985, the then-raging Cola Wars even made their way to the final frontier when both Coke and Pepsi developed special microgravity-compatible cans to allow their respective brands of carbonated sugar water to be consumed in space. Flown aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger on mission STS-51F, the cans featured push-button valves and short straws to allow astronauts to squirt the content directly into their mouths. Unfortunately, astronaut Cola proved a bigger flop than New Coke. Not only did the shuttle not have a refrigerator, forcing the soda to be consumed at room temperature, but without gravity to separate gas from liquid in the stomach, escaping carbon dioxide from the carbonation resulted in an unpleasant form of vomiting known as wet burping. The astronauts universally preferred their traditional powdered drinks, which could be prepared cold using the shuttle's onboard water supply. Moving on from there, when the International Space Station was first occupied in the year 2000, the only galley was located in the Russian orbital segment and consisted of a table for three, a warm hot water dispenser, and an electrical induction heater for warming Russian metal food tins. Later, American astronauts installed a second briefcase-sized food warmer in the Unity module capable of accommodating NASA's flexible food pouches. Today, around half the food aboard the ISS is supplied by the United States and the other half by Russia and other countries. As the only refrigerators aboard the station are reserved for scientific experiments, all food must be shelf-stable for up to 18 months. According to the current NASA system, all food aboard the ISS falls into one of 8 categories. Number 1, beverages, fruit juice powders or instant coffee and tea that is rehydrated from the station's onboard water supply. 2, fresh foods, fruits, vegetables and other perishables flown up every 6 months by resupply missions, which must be consumed quickly before they spoil, as regular bread tends to produce so troublesome crumbs. The preferred bread product for making sandwiches aboard the ISS is the flour tortilla. Number 3, irradiated meat, beef and other meats which have been bombarded with gamma radiation to sterilize it. Number 4, intermediate moisture foods, foods with some water content but not enough to cause immediate spoilage, such as dry sausage and beef jerky. Number 5, natural form foods, commercially available shelf-stable foods such as cookies and granola bars that can be packed and eaten unmodified. A particular popular snack is M&M's, generically labeled by NASA as candy-coated chocolates. Number 6, rehydratable foods, dehydrated or freeze-dried items as used on Gemini, Apollo and the Space Shuttle, which can be restored to their original forms using the onboard water supply. Number 7, thermostabilized foods, a modern form of the Apollo-era wet pack in which food is heated to high temperatures in its packaging to sterilize it. And number 8, extended shelf-life bread products, which are baked goods like scones and waffles, specifically formulated for long-term shelf stability. Within these categories, ISS astronauts enjoy a bewildering variety of options to choose from, with the American menu including such items as scrambled eggs, teriyaki beef, spaghetti bolognese, cashew curry chicken, and even breakfast cereal, which consists of dry cereal and milk powder into which cold water is injected just before consumption. Other space agencies have also produced space-rated versions of traditional foods such as Japanese ramen and sushi and Korean kimchi. Some items, however, have proven too offbeat for even hardy folk like astronauts. For example, Swedish astronaut Christer Fulgersang was forbidden from bringing reindeer jerky because it would be too weird for his American colleagues so close to Christmas. He was forced to bring moose jerky instead. As previously mentioned, nasal congestion caused by fluid buildup in microgravity can dull an astronaut's sense of taste by up to 30%, so spicy condiments like mustard, hot sauce, and wasabi are understandably popular. Some of these items, however, must be specially adapted to the unique challenges of microgravity. For example, loose salt and pepper could potentially get loose in the cabin and wreak havoc, so they are mixed with water and olive oil respectively and stored in squeeze bottles so they can be safely squirted into food pouches. As for eating frequency and specific selection, ISS astronauts eat 3 meals per day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, with the menu repeating on an 8-day cycle. 5 months before launch, NASA astronauts visit the Space Food Systems lab at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, to sample the various options and put together their personal menus for their mission. The astronaut selections are evaluated by NASA nutritionists for caloric and nutritional content, and additions and substitutions are made as needed to ensure a balanced diet. The finalized menu items are then marked with different colored stickers so they can be identified by their owners. The meals are also marked with a barcode which must be scanned when consumed, allowing flight surgeons to keep track of what each astronaut eats throughout a mission. In addition to the approved NASA offerings, astronauts are also allowed to bring non-standard items in a small bonus container, provided they meet requirements for shelf stability, nutritional value, and microgravity consumption. Among the most popular bonus items are extra tortillas, as the standard NASA menu only allots astronauts 1 per day. But while the astronaut dining experience has not yet reached the heady days of Skylab, important improvements are being made every year. For example, the Chinese Tiangong space station, launched in April 2021, features features the world's first microwave oven in space, while the 2015 Italian firms Argotec and Lavazza created the IS Espresso, the first coffee machine designed specifically for use in space. On May 3rd, 2015, Italian astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti, appropriately dressed in a Star Trek captain's uniform, became the first person to taste orbitally brewed espresso, prompting American astronaut Scott Kelly to quip, "That's one small step for a woman, one giant leap for coffee." The device remained installed aboard the ISS until 2007, when it was taken back to Earth. With astronauts making longer and longer stays in space and manned missions to Mars seemingly just around the corner, space food technology must continue to evolve to meet these new challenges. Currently, extensive research is being performed on how to bake bread and even brew beer in space, as well as how to grow grains, vegetables, and other crops on other planets, a key capability if humanity is to colonize the solar system. So, while we may be far off from an astronaut being able to float up to a replicator module and ask for tea, Earl Grey, hot, at least the space food of the future will be infinitely more palatable than the squeeze tube and tang menus of yesteryear. Buying bread from a man in Brussels, he was 6'4" and full of muscle. I said, "Do you speak my language?" He just smiled and gave me a Vegemite sandwich. So goes one of the most iconic verses from Australian rock band Men at Work's 1981 international smash hit Down Under, chronicling the travels of an Australian man and the colourful characters he meets around the world. The song has become something of an unofficial anthem for the land of Oz, perhaps more so than Waltzing Matilda or the actual national anthem, Advance Australia Fair. As a note to all things Aussie, the song naturally includes a reference to that most quintessentially Australian of foodstuffs, Vegemite, a dark brown sticky spread with the consistency of used motor oil and a uniquely pungent, salty, savoury flavour described as somewhere between beef and soy sauce. And for over 100 years, Vegemite has been a cornerstone of Australian culture, with over 22 million jars being produced every year and around 80% of Australian households having at least one jar in their pantries. But what is Vegemite anyway? What is it made of? Who invented it? And how did such a bizarre product come to be such a beloved symbol of the land down under? Well, grab your slouch hat and boomerang and fire up your ute as we dive into the surprisingly long and fascinating history of Australia's strange and beloved snack. While Vegemite, as we know it today, first appeared on Australian store shelves in 1923, to understand its origins, we must first travel 80 years into the past and 15,000 kilometers away to mid-19th century Germany. Our story begins in 1847 with the legendary German chemist Justus Freiherr von Liebig, perhaps best remembered today for his contributions to organic chemistry and for inventing the von Liebig condenser, a distillation apparatus still found in chemistry laboratories around the world. In 1815, when von Liebig was just 12 years old, the eruption of Mount Tambor in Indonesia launched vast quantities of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, triggering a significant drop in global temperatures. The resulting year without summer was marked by widespread crop failures and famines that killed an estimated 100,000 people worldwide. This event had a profound impact on von Liebig, who would devote much of his career to improving crop science and global nutrition. For example, in 1840, he determined that the growth of plants is dependent on 5 chemical elements: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, hydrogen, and carbon. While the latter 2 are extracted from air and water, the rest must be drawn from the soil and can be supplemented through the use of fertilizers such as livestock manure and bird droppings, aka guano. This monumental discovery would later lead to the development of chemical fertilizers, which significantly boosted crop yields and allowed billions more people around the world to be fed. In 1947, von Liebig developed a process for producing cheap, nutritious meat extract that he dubbed extractum carnis Liebig. This process involved trimming unwanted fat from choicer cuts of meat, grinding it, mixing it with water, and then boiling down this mixture to produce a thick paste. Von Liebig hoped his extract would help supplement the diet of those too poor to afford regular meat, but unfortunately, the limited supply of cattle and other livestock in Europe made this plan uneconomical. Von Liebig thus openly published the details of his process, writing that, quote, "The benefit of it should be placed at the command of as large a number of persons as possible by the extension of the manufacture and consequently a reduction in the cost." But it would be another decade and a half before the great chemist's dream finally became a reality. In 1862, German railway engineer George Christian Giebert, along with von Liebig and a group of investors, founded the Société de Frais Bentos Giebert and Compagnie and constructed a pilot beef extract plant in the town of Avila Independencia in Uruguay, later renamed Fray Bentos. These being the days before refrigerated ships and rail cars or large-scale meat canning, cattle in South America were largely slaughtered for their leather, producing a large surplus of cheap meat and allowing extractum carnis Liebig to be produced at 1/3 the cost of in Europe. This venture was immediately successful, with nearly 28,000 kilograms of the extract being sold in 1864. The following year, von Liebig assumed the directorship of the firm, which was named the Liebig Extract of Meat Company, to capitalize on his famous name. Ironically, however, this marketing tactic worked a little too well, as Liebig Extract of Meat soon became a genericized term for this product and was used by several other companies in their marketing. Indeed, a judge ruled that the name had fallen into general use and could thus no longer be trademarked, forcing the Liebig Extract of Meat Company to change its name to the more distinctive Lemco. In 1873, Lemco established a corned beef canning operation under the name Fray Bentos. This too proved extraordinarily successful, especially during the Boer War of 1899 to 1902 and the Great War of 1914 to 1918, when millions of tins were supplied to the British Armed Forces as standard field rations. Fray Bentos soon entered the British vernacular as a generic term for corned beef and a slang word meaning very good. And in a classic example of British wartime humour, the crew of the British Mark IV tank F-41 christened their giant metal can of a vehicle, you guessed it, Fray Bentos. On August 22, 1917, during the Third Battle of Ypres, Fray Bentos trundled into action near St. Julien, Belgium, only to become stuck in the mud near the German trenches. Over the next 60 hours, the crew heroically fought off repeated German infantry attacks before escaping back to Allied lines, an action which earned them the most decorations of any tank crew of the First World War, but that's an incredible story for another video. But in any event, as a result of such massive global sales, Fray Bentos became known as the kitchen of the world, with the town's meat processing plant expanding into one of the largest industrial complexes in all of South America. At its peak, Fray Bentos employed more than 5,000 people, processed one cow every 5 minutes. In 1899, Lemco changed the name of its flagship beef extract to Oxo, a brand name still familiar to millions of households around the world today. During the 1908 Summer Olympics in London, Lemco made history by supplying British athletes with Oxo to fortify them, becoming the game's first corporate sponsor. However, the cost of the original liquid formulation was still beyond the means of many families, prompting Lemco to work with English chemist Henry Enfield to develop an even cheaper version. The result was the first solid Oxo bouillon cubes introduced in 1910 at a cost of only a penny each. These also proved extraordinarily popular, with over 100 million being supplied to the British Armed Forces during the First World War. In 1924, Lemco was acquired by British food conglomerate Vesti Holdings. By this time, the company had grown so successful that they were forced to expand their operations, and in 1928 they purchased a former Royal power station in Southwark, London, for a conversion into a cold storage facility. Part of the redesign involved the construction of an Art Deco tower on the banks of the Thames, on which Lemco planned to mount illuminated signs advertising its products. However, these plans were rejected by the London government, riverside advertising being banned at the time. Instead, architect Albert Moore cheekily redesigned the tower to feature 2 circular and 1 X-shaped windows, spelling out the word Oxo. Despite seriously stretching the city's rules regarding public advertising, the Oxo Tower was allowed to stand, and this now iconic landmark continues to grace the London skyline to this day. In 1968, the Oxo brand was bought by Anglo-Dutch multinational Unilever, who in 2001 sold it to the American Campbell Soup Company. In 2006, the UK branch was bought out by Premier Foods, which continues to produce Oxo cubes and other products to this day. Despite its pioneering role and extraordinary success, Lemco was far from the only player in the burgeoning meat extract market. In 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, French Emperor Napoleon III ordered 1 million cans of beef from Scottish-born Canadian butcher John Lawson Johnston. However, while large quantities of cheap beef were readily available from Canada and South America, canning technology had not yet been fully perfected, making it difficult for Lawson Johnston to fill Napoleon's order. He thus developed a less perishable, concentrated beef extract similar to Oxo, which he dubbed Johnston's Fluid Beef. This was later changed to Bovril, a combination of the Latin bovinus, or ox, and vril, a fictional energy source from British writer Edward Bulwer-Lytton's 1871 science fiction novel Vril, The Power of the Coming Race. And if that name sounds familiar, Bulwer-Lytton is the prolific originator of such now cliched phrases as pursuit of the almighty dollar, the great unwashed masses, the pen is mightier than the sword, and the classic novel opening, it was a dark and stormy night. The more you know. Appropriately, he is the namesake of the annual tongue-in-cheek Bulwer-Lytton fiction contest, in which contestants compete to craft the opening sentence of the worst of all possible novels. Like Oxo and Fray Bentos, Bovril quickly became a British institution, with large quantities being supplied to British forces during the Boer War and the First and Second World Wars. Mixed with hot water or even milk, Bovril is a classic hearty drink for cold weather, becoming inextricably associated with British football culture and famously sustaining Sir Ernest Shackleton and his crew during their ill-fated 1914 to 1917 Antarctic expedition. So famous and beloved was Bovril in the early 20th century that it holds the distinction of being one of the few products to be openly endorsed by the Pope, with Pope Leo XIII appearing in a series of advertisements along with the slogan, "The two infallible powers, the Pope and Bovril." In 2001, Bovril was bought out by Unilever, who in 2004 made the controversial decision to remove the beef ingredients from the formula to make the beloved brand vegetarian. Several reasons were cited for this move, including the rise in popularity of vegetarianism and the recent mad cow disease scare, which had led to an export ban on British beef. The company also wanted to expand sales to nations like Malaysia, which has strict regulations on the import of non-halal beef products. However, following public outrage and the lifting of export bans, in 2006 Unilever reversed its decision and reintroduced the original beef-based Bovril to the market. And, well, there was much rejoicing. Yet despite their beloved status in British culture, the purported nutritional benefits of Oxo, Bovril, and other similar meat extracts turned out to be highly overblown. Indeed, studies conducted in the 1860s revealed that dogs fed nothing but Liebig extract of meat quickly died. As science historian Mark Finlay later wrote, the assumption that Liebig's extract of meat was extremely nutritious came under heavy attack. Dozens of articles and analyses were published on the issue. In fact, most studies proved that Liebig's meat extract contained virtually no trace of fats, gelatins, and proteins. In brief, it lacked the very basis of meat's nutrition value. Most experts soon agreed that meat extract must be placed exceedingly low in the scale of direct or absolute nutrients. End quote. As a result, companies like Lemco and Lawson Johnson were forced to change their marketing, rebranding their products as comfort items, athletic stimulants, or easily digestible food for invalids. Indeed, by the late 1860s, St Thomas's Hospital in London reportedly consumed 12,000 pots of Liebig extract every year. Thankfully, however, Justus von Liebig was on hand once again with an innovative solution. In the 1890s, the great chemist discovered how to make a savory and nutritious extract from an industrial byproduct far cheaper than meat, leftover brewer's yeast, aka lees. This process involved heating the yeast until the cells died and ruptured, whereupon the cell's own enzymes broke down their proteins into similar peptides and amino acids, a process known as autolysis. The resulting slurry was then centrifuged, filtered, and air-dried to form either a thick paste or dry powder, similar in consistency and flavor to Oxo or Bovril. The extract's distinctive savory or umami taste derived largely from the presence of various glutamates, including monosodium glutamate, that's MSG. The first firm to exploit this discovery was the Marmite Food Extract Company, founded in 1902 in Burton-upon-Trent, Staffordshire. For its factory, the company rented a disused malt house for £100 a year, using as its raw material used yeast supplies by the nearby Bass Brewery. The name Marmite, while pronounced in English as Marmite, was derived from the French marmite, meaning cauldron or stock pot, the image of which prominently features on the Marmite label and which inspired the distinctive shape of the Marmite jar. For its first few years of operation, the Marmite Food Extract Company struggled to get off the ground. British yeast varieties and fermentation methods, it was discovered, were less well suited to the von Liebig process than their European counterparts, requiring new varieties and equipment to be imported from the continent at great expense. Furthermore, the unique and divisive taste of Marmite made it a hard sell even to a British people by now well used to beef extracts like Oxo and Bovril. Nonetheless, by 1907, the company had become successful enough to warrant the construction of a second factory at Camberwell Green in South London. And in 1910, Marmite received a huge boost thanks to a major scientific breakthrough, the discovery of vitamins. For nearly 2 centuries, physicians and biologists had suspected that certain diseases were caused by a lack of some unknown vital factor in the sufferer's diet. For instance, sailors on long voyages typically had been ravaged by scurvy, whose symptoms include weakness, fatigue, easy bruising, bleeding gums, tooth loss, and eventually death, while in Southeast Asia, beriberi, characterized by severe weight loss, edema, lower body paralysis, and confusion, has long been endemic. In 1747, Scottish physician James Lind conducted a series of experiments demonstrating the effectiveness of citrus fruit for preventing and curing scurvy. Despite opposition from the mainstream medical community, who ascribed scurvy to a variety of other causes, the Royal Navy began issuing lemons and limes aboard its ships, resulting in British sailors, and eventually British people in general, acquiring the nickname of limeys. Unfortunately, however, this did not mark the end of scurvy in the Royal Navy, for lemons and limes were too expensive to be issued on a universal basis. Furthermore, lemon and lime juice did not keep well on long sea voyages, while boiling and concentrating it destroyed its anti-scorbutic properties. It was not until the 1770s, following experiments conducted by Captain James Cook during his first voyage to the South Pacific, that the Royal Navy discovered that pickled cabbage, aka sauerkraut, was just as if not more effective than lemons and limes at preventing scurvy, and it was much less perishable. Only when sauerkraut began to be widely issued aboard Royal Navy ships did rates of scurvy finally begin to decline. 100 years later, in 1881, Russian physician Nikolai Lunin conducted a series of experiments in which one group of laboratory mice was fed milk, while another was fed a mixture of all the known constituents of milk: protein, fat, carbohydrates, and salt. The mice in the second group all died, leading Lunin to conclude that, quote, a natural food such as milk must therefore contain, besides these known principal ingredients, small quantities of unknown substances essential to life. 3 years later, physician Takaaki Kanehiro of the Imperial Japanese Navy observed that while beriberi was endemic among the lower and middle classes, whose diet consisted mostly of polished white rice, the upper classes, who ate a more Western diet, were largely unaffected. He thus conducted an experiment using the crews of 2 battleships, one of which was fed only white rice, and the other a varied diet of meat, fish, barley, rice, and beans. By the end of the experiment, the former group suffered 161 cases of beriberi and 25 deaths, and the latter only 14 cases and no deaths. Unfortunately, the Navy misinterpreted the results and concluded that beriberi was caused by protein deficiency. As a result, the disease continued to ravage the region. It was not until 1897 that Dutch physician and physiologist Christian Eijkman, working in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, discovered that feeding chickens, and later people, unpolished brown rice prevented and cured beriberi, leading him to postulate the existence of what English biochemist Frederick Hopkins later called accessory factors in the rice bran, factors that were stripped away by the polishing process. Finally, in 1910, Japanese scientist Umataro Suzuki managed to extract and isolate this accessory factor, dubbing it baric acid. 2 years later, Polish biochemist Casimir Funk repeated Suzuki's experiments and, at the suggestion of fellow biochemist Maximilian Nierenstein, dubbed the extracted nutrient complexes vitamines, short for vital amines. Suzuki's baric acid was soon renamed thiamine, or vitamin B1, the first of the modern vitamin complexes to be discovered. Many more would follow, including retinol, or vitamin A, in 1913, and ascorbic acid, or vitamin C, the cause of the age-old scourge of scurvy, in 1920. But while Casimir Funk originally believed that all accessory factors were chemical amines, this turned out to not be the case, prompting British biochemist Jack Drummond to suggest in 1920 that the E in vitamin be dropped, creating the modern word vitamin. For their role in discovering vitamins, in 1928, Christian Eijkman and Frederick Hopkins were awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine. In the wake of these breakthroughs, it was discovered that Marmite happened to be rich in B vitamins, including thiamine, or B1, riboflavin, or B2, and B12, or cobalamin, a fact which finally endeared the product to the British people and caused sales to skyrocket. Sold as a highly nutritious superfood under the simple but effective slogan, "Good for you," Marmite was widely served in British schools and hospitals and other institutions as a dietary supplement, while millions of jars were issued to British servicemen and prisoners of war, and provided as aid to war-torn countries during both world wars in order to stave off beriberi. As one British soldier recalled, prisoners of war sometimes resorted to subterfuge to prevent their Marmite from being confiscated by camp guards. To quote, "While in prison camp, aid parcels would arrive, but our captors would supervise the unpacking of these parcels, taking anything good for themselves. When they came to Marmite, they would ask, 'What's this for?' Our reply was, 'Stuff to rub on your boots.' They would say, 'You can have,' and let them keep the Marmite." The sticky black stuff even played a vital role in a major dietary science breakthrough. In the late 1930s, English hematologist Lucy Wills travelled to Bombay, India, modern-day Mumbai, to study what was then known as pernicious anemia of pregnancy, which largely affected Indian women employed in the textile industry. Wills soon discovered that this affliction differed from regular pernicious anemia, a lack of red blood cells caused by a deficiency of vitamin B12, which could be treated using liver extracts. Rather, it was a form of macrocytic anemia, in which the red blood cells are larger than usual. Following experiments with mice, Willis postulated the existence of an unknown Willis factor, the richest source of which he found to be yeast extracts like Marmite.
In the 1940s, this factor was identified as folate, or vitamin B9, the synthetic version of which, folic acid, is now added to all sorts of food products, including wheat flour, in order to stave off macrocytic anemia in pregnant women and birth defects in children. By the 1920s, Marmite had become yet another British culinary institution, most commonly consumed by spreading it very thinly on buttered toast or adding it to soups and stews. Even its infamously bizarre and divisive flavour became a part of the brand's identity, with Marmite adopting the cheeky slogan, "Love it or hate it," as part of the 1996 advertising campaign. Indeed, over the years, Marmite has become a popular byword for an acquired taste, or a person, group, or anything else that divides public opinion. Yet this divisiveness did not stop Marmite from becoming popular across the British Commonwealth, or from inspiring similar products including Synovus in Switzerland, Cenevite in Brazil, Condibe in Argentina, Varndox in France, Guinness yeast extract in Ireland, Vitamin R in Germany, and, of course, Vegemite in Australia. And yes, after nearly 3,500 words, we finally got into the main topic of this video. We're sorry, but thank you for still being here. What can we say? Love it or hate it, history's complicated. Vegemite was created in the early 1920s by Fred Walker and Company, a food canning and import-export firm based in Melbourne. Founded in 1908 by the eponymous Fred Walker, in 1910 the company began canning meats, butter and cheese for export to Asia, South Africa and the UK, while in 1918 they introduced Bonox, a beef extract similar to Oxo and Bovril. In 1919, however, disruption of global trade caused by the First World War led to a severe slump in food imports and exports and shortages of various products, including Marmite. This prompted company founder and chairman Fred Walker to task chemist Cyril Callister with developing an indigenous alternative. Callister sourced leftover yeast from a nearby brewery, Carlton and United, and processed it using Justus von Liebig's autolysis method, and blended the resulting product with salt, celery and onion extracts and caramel coloring to produce a sticky dark brown paste similar to Marmite, but with its own distinct flavor profile. Walker & Co. ran a contest to name the new spread, offering a prize of $50 Australian, the equivalent of about $4,500 today. In the end, the name Vegemite was selected by Walker's daughter, Sheila. Vegemite first hit Australian store shelves in 1923, with Walker & Co.'s advertising emphasizing the product's healthful virtues, especially for growing children. However, the product failed to take off at first, especially as the resumption of global trade brought increased competition from the already well-established Marmite brand. In desperation, in 1928, the company changed the name of the product from Vegemite to Parwill, solely so they could use the atrociously punny advertising slogan, "Marmite, but Parwill." Shockingly, this brilliant wordplay failed to sway consumers, and in 1935 the extract's name was switched back to Vegemite. With sales still lagging far behind those of Marmite, the story of Vegemite might have ended there, were it not for a wise business decision made nearly a decade before. In 1926, Fred Walker partnered with Kraft Foods Inc. to form the Kraft Walker Cheese Company, an Australian subsidiary focused on manufacturing and exporting processed cheese. This venture was highly successful and helped carry Fred Walker & Co. through its financial difficulties in the 20s and 30s. In 1935, the same year the ill-fated Parwill brand was switched back to Vegemite, Fred Walker died, and his company was wholly acquired by Kraft Foods Inc., later Mondelez International. Kraft used its considerable marketing resources to heavily promote Vegemite, giving away free samples with Kraft Walker cheese products and funding poetry contests and other promotional events. As with Marmite, sales received a huge boost in 1939 when the British Medical Association officially endorsed Vegemite as a rich source of B vitamins. And during the Second World War, University of Adelaide physiologist Cedric Hicks recommended that Vegemite be rationed at home so it could be supplied to Australian troops, a fact heavily promoted in the company's advertisements. Quoting here, "Vegemite fights with the men up north. If you are one of those who don't need Vegemite medicinally, then thousands of invalids are asking you to deny yourself of it for the time being." End quote. And when the troops came home, they brought their newly acquired taste for Vegemite with them, such that by the late 1940s, Vegemite was found in nearly 90% of Australian households. Throughout the post-war period, Kraft Walker's advertising continued to focus on Vegemite's health benefits for children, with a beloved advertising campaign created by J. Walter Thompson Advertising, featuring healthy, happy children singing a now classic jingle. "We're happy little Vegemites, as bright can be. We all enjoy our Vegemite for breakfast, lunch and tea. Our mummies say we're growing stronger every single week because we love our Vegemite. We all adore our Vegemite. It puts a rose in every cheek." This jingle was first broadcast on the radio in 1954 and adapted for television in 1956. After running continuously for nearly a decade, the ad was retired and replaced by a new campaign featuring the now equally iconic slogan, "Pass the Vegemite, please, Mum." In April 1984, the brand made retail history when a 115-gram container of Vegemite became the first product to be electronically scanned in an Australian supermarket, the transaction taking place at a Woolworths in Chullora, New South Wales, and costing 55 Australian cents. 2 years later, the original 1956 Happy Little Vegemite ad was partially colorized and rebroadcast, and once again it proved highly successful, running until 1991. Finally, in 2023, a new group of Happy Little Vegemites was cast alongside 71-year-old Trush Kavanagh, the original baton-twirling girl from the television ad, ensuring that the beloved jingle will continue to rattle around Australians' heads for generations to come. More than 100 years after its introduction, Vegemite remains an inextricable part of Australian culture, with Bega Cheese, the brand's current owner since 2017, churning out some 22 million jars, and Aussies consuming some 1.2 billion servings of the stuff every year. In October 2008, the 1 billionth jar of Vegemite rolled off the Bega production line in Melbourne. As Jamie Callister, grandson of Vegemite inventor Cyril Callister, said in an interview, quote, "It's part of our DNA. It's something I grew up with and was just always there. It's become a badge of honor for Australians, whether they are a fan of it or not." Indeed, the brand has expanded significantly since its introduction, with Vegemite finding its way into all sorts of products, including popular snacks like Arnott's Shapes crackers, sausages, chocolate in a biscuit, and Smith's Crisps, sausages and meat pies, chocolate and smoothies, yes really, Vegemite singles flavored processed cheese slices, and Vegemite Cheesy Bite, a cream cheese Vegemite combination first introduced in 2009 and originally given the very 2000s name iSnack 2.0 before customer backlash forced a change. It has also spawned several imitators, including Chromite, introduced in the 1950s by Henry Lewis and Company and now owned by Mars Incorporated, and Aussiemite, launched in 2001. A version of Marmite has also been produced by the New Zealand Sanitarium Health and Wellbeing Company since 1919. Thus, the original British product is marketed as Our Mate in Australasia and Enzymite in the rest of the world. These products differ slightly in composition and flavour, with the New Zealand Marmite in particular incorporating large amounts of sugar. But the Australian original, whether spread on sandwiches and toast or mixed into stews and other recipes, remains by far the most popular in the region, and with good reason. Vegemite is extremely nutritious, with one serving containing 0.5 milligrams of vitamin B1, 0.43 milligrams of B2, 2.5 of B3, and 0.1 milligrams of folate. It is also certified vegan, kosher, and halal, meaning it can be eaten by just about everybody. Yet despite their beloved status, Vegemite and its Eastleigh cousins have not been without controversies. For instance, in 2006, the Australian media reported that Vegemite had been banned in the United States, and that United States Customs Service agents had been instructed to search the luggage of Australian visitors for the foreign black goop. This, however, turned out to be little more than an urban legend, with the United States Customs and Border Protection issuing an official statement that no such ban had been implemented. But in 2001, much to the consternation of Commonwealth expats, Denmark did ban the import of foods fortified with additional vitamins, a category which includes Vegemite and Marmite. That same year, structural damage inflicted by the February 22nd Christchurch earthquake forced the New Zealand Marmite factory to shut down production for nearly 2 years, leading to widespread shortages and panic buying that news outlets amusingly named Marmageddon. On a more serious note, in 2015 it was reported that Vegemite, Marmite, and similar yeast spreads were banned in Australian prisons, and that similar bans were being considered for dry Aboriginal communities in the outback, allegedly since these products could be used to illicitly brew alcohol. However, this assertion was quickly shown to be false, with Dr. Ben Scholes of the University of Queensland explaining in an interview, "The rationale for that previously was that Vegemite was a good source of yeast, and you needed yeast to ferment the sugar and turn that into alcohol. But we've shown that there is nothing that is alive in Vegemite. Indeed, the Vegemite is a really good nutrient source. It is a really good food source for the yeast. So, if you have the sugar for them to ferment, Vegemite to give the yeast extra food, then any yeast that is around will ferment pretty effectively, but you need the yeast." As a result, no such bans have been implemented outside of Britain's infamous Dartmoor prison, with then Australian Liberal Party leader and leader of the opposition Tony Abbott stating, "This is a deregulatory government, and the last thing I want to do is have a Vegemite watch, because Vegemite, quite properly, is for most people a reasonably nutritious spread on your morning toast or on your sandwiches. So take comfort, all you Aussies, or Aussies at heart, love it or hate it. Vegemite is here to stay. Cheers, mates."
The creation of the Village People is directly attributed to French composer and producer Jacques Morali, a gay man who wanted to create disco music gay men would appreciate. Morali, a legendary disco beatsmith who was responsible for producing a string of disco hits in the early 1970s, was approached by a struggling singer called Victor Willis with a demo tape in 1977. Morali liked the demo and came up with the idea of packaging Willis as a member of a group called, well, you guessed it, Village People. As to why he chose the name Village People, this was a nod to the thriving gay community in Greenwich Village, New York. Morali, using his clout in the disco world, saw to it that his new creation was signed to Casablanca Records, and soon after, the Village People released their first self-titled album in 1977, with Willis the only member of the group. To maintain the illusion that the Village People was an actual group and not just a carefully crafted gimmick, Morali employed extensive use of vocal layering and backup singers while recording and mixing the aforementioned album. Initially, there was little problem with there only being one Village person, but soon enough the album started gaining traction and the group began receiving offers to perform live in clubs around New York. As he couldn't just send Willis out to sing on his own, Morali hired a team of dancers and backup singers to support Willis on stage. Alright, so at this point in the video you might be wondering, well, where did the crazy outfits come in? So again, Morali was looking to craft a band that would appeal and somewhat represent certain facets of gay culture at the time. It was during the process of researching how best to implement that when inspiration struck. According to Morali's business partner Henri Belolo, the look of the Village People was inspired by an experience he and Morali had in a Greenwich gay bar. This bar was having something of a costume party. Specifically, Belolo would recall in an interview with DiscoDisco.com that I was talking to the gay community about what they liked, what they wanted to listen to musically, and what was their dream, their fantasy. One day, producer Jacques Morali and I were walking around the streets of New York. I remember clearly that it was down in the Village, and we saw an Indian walking down the street and heard the bells on his feet. We followed him into a bar. He was a bartender, and he was serving and also dancing on the bar. And while we were watching him dancing and sipping our beer, we saw a cowboy watching him dance. The Frenchman Morali, who was already a bit enamored by American culture and stereotypes, had a light bulb go off in his head. He stated in an interview with Rolling Stone, I say to myself, you know, this is fantastic, to see the cowboy, the Indian, the construction worker with other men around. And also, I think in myself that the gay people have no group, nobody to personalize the gay people, you know? Thus, he ultimately approached the man dressed as a stereotypical depiction of a Native American. This was Felipe Rose. Rose explained that he chose that outfit as his father was Lakota Sioux. As they got to know each other, Morali laid out to Rose his plan for a new disco group. Rose stated of this, Jacques showed me a sketch drawing of what looked to me like the group, with me drawn in, and a cowboy and construction worker and a biker. He said, we've built a group around you, darling, and I am going to make you famous. I thought, oh God, Jesus Christ, what is this man doing? This is an awful idea. Eventually, Morali nailed down all the roles that he believed were simultaneously universally recognizable, at least to the American man, and embodied the macho masculine ideals that he felt typified that particular element of the gay scene. These were soldier, police officer, construction worker, cowboy, biker, Native American, and sailor, some combination of which has served as the basis of the group ever since. To fill out these roles, Morali placed an ad in the paper that simply read, Macho types wanted, must dance and have a moustache. As the group already had its Native American, the casting was to find the construction worker, the cowboy, and the biker, also sometimes referred to as the Leatherman. Oddly, Willis himself initially didn't wear a costume on stage, something you can see in early music videos that were released by the group, and it wasn't until the group's fame grew that he decided to dress as either a policeman or a sailor when performing. Another early member of the group, Alex Briley, simply performed sans costume, but quickly adopted the persona of the all-American GI when the look of the group became one of its trademark selling points. It should be noted here that contrary to popular belief, you did not have to be gay to be a member of the band. Indeed, several band members over the years were not or are not gay. As original band's member, the cowboy Randy Jones, who is gay, noted, we didn't start as a gay group, and not everyone in the group was gay. That's an incorrect notion. The Village People was a mixture of ethnicity, races, lifestyles, sexualities, sexual orientations. It was a true village. It was a mixture of everything. Despite this, given their band was specifically formed by Morali to represent gay subculture, it's no surprise that not only was their iconic look crafted to reference said culture, but many of their songs are dripping with double entendres and references that mainstream audiences at the time generally missed. This was a good thing for the popularity of the band given attitudes of the era in which the band was topping the charts. Nowhere is this more apparent than the Village People's biggest hit, YMCA. Morali was inspired to write the song after seeing the letters on the side of a building and asking what they meant. Band member David Hodo, the construction worker, later recalled, "It was 1977, and we were leaving a photography session on 23rd Street. Jacques Morali saw the big pink YMCA on 23rd Street and asked, 'What is this YMCA anyway?' And after laughing at his accent, we told him that the Y was the place where you could go when you first came to New York when you didn't have any money. You can stay there for very little. And of course, someone joked, 'Yeah, but don't bend over in the showers.' And Jacques, bless his heart, said, 'I will write a song about this.'" In a retrospective of the song's genesis and eventual success, the aforementioned Randy Jones expanded upon this story, stating, "I took Jacques there 3 or 4 times in 1977 and he loved it. He was fascinated by a place where a person could work out with weights, play basketball, swim, take classes, and get a room. Plus, with Jacques being gay, I had a lot of friends I worked out with who were in the adult film industry, and he was impressed by meeting people he had seen in the videos and magazines. Those visits with me planted a seed in him, and that's how he got the idea for YMCA." Hodo would further ring in, "YMCA certainly has a gay origin. That's what Jacques was thinking when he wrote it, because our first album, 1997's Village People, was possibly the gayest album ever. I mean, look at us, we were a gay group. So was the song written to celebrate gay men at the YMCA? Yes, absolutely. And gay people love it." Despite this, Michael Musto of the Village Voice notes that Morali seemingly went out of his way to write every song with a plausible deniability factor that the Village People still use to rebuff allegations of targeting a gay audience. Or as professor at Johns Hopkins University called Dr. Drew Daniel once so succinctly put it, "The good, clean fun at the surface level of the lyrics means that YMCA has this incredible capacity to circulate in different contexts. If people really thought they were singing about gay hookups in the steam room, they would not necessarily participate." As for how the now iconic moves that go along with the chorus of the song came about, the band members themselves have mildly differing stories as to the origin, though in all cases it would seem it was an audience-inspired set of moves rather than originally planned. For example, Randy Jones states, "We were flying up from South America for the show, and we worked on the choreography on the airplane. Hand claps, turning, marching in place, stuff like that. Well, the audience at this particular taping was a bunch of kids bussed in from a cheerleader camp. The first time we got to the chorus, we were clapping our hands above our heads, and the kids thought it looked like we were making a Y. So they immediately did the letters. We saw this and started doing letters with them. It was purely audience generated, which is probably why it's still so popular. And that's great for me because it keeps the checks coming in every 6 months." So just to recap here, a gay Frenchman created the Village People, named them after a region of New York known for its thriving gay community, had them sing gay-themed music aimed at gay men in a gay way, including dressing in outfits inspired by those worn by gay men going clubbing. Morali and co. ultimately pulled the whole thing off, making the band one of the most iconic of the disco era, all the while few outside of the gay community got the references. Now this, given the attitudes of the era, if we were Morali, would have provided us with no end of private chuckles. So on a similarly humorous note, the music video for the band's hit In the Navy was notably filmed on an actual frigate, the USS Reasoner, whose motto was officially fidelity. This was all thanks to the group's manager securing a deal with the US Navy. The deal was that the Navy would get to use the song for free in Navy recruitment advertisements, and in return, the band would be given access to the military hardware for their shoot. What makes this particularly hilarious is that around the same time the Navy was allowing a group representing certain facets of gay culture to sing aboard a Navy frigate about the Navy being a place where you can find pleasure, with original intent to use this music in Navy recruitment, they were also spending millions of dollars attempting to rout out any gay people from their ranks. These efforts included a hilariously inept search for a woman called Dorothy, who they were convinced knew every gay person in the military. We actually did an entirely separate video about that subject, which you will find linked to in the description below. Then, in a further effort to get rid of any lesbians as well, Vice Admiral Joseph S. Donnell issued a memo noting how these women could be identified. To quote him, Experience has shown that the stereotypical female homosexual in the Navy is hardworking, career-orientated, willing to put in long hours on the job, and among the command's top professionals. Seriously, we couldn't make this stuff up. In any event, unfortunately for the irony of it all, the Navy ultimately scrapped plans to use the village peoples in the Navy in their ad campaigns. No real surprise there. Now for a bonus fact. In response to people getting offended by the cartoonish depiction of a Native American in the group, longtime band member Felipe Rose, who, as noted, portrays said Native American and whose father was Lakota, stated, "Snap out of it. Grow up. I've had some tribal members speak up against me. The headdress is certainly controversial, but I really only wear it for YMCA when we perform it live to remind people of the image. No one's ever told me I have a shitty job though." Fellow bands member Eric Anzalone chimed in, "Personal opinion, I do believe that the world is moving towards a dangerous grey area of political correctness. We take everything so literally that it sucks the joy out of everything. If you remove it out of the decade we originated, you're not being true to when we hit our mark. We're a little campy and we're a little fun, so let's leave everything at the door."
Take a flight 400 kilometers due south from Peruvian capital Lima, and you will find yourself over the Pampas de Germana, an 80 kilometer stretch of coastal desert sandwiched between the Andes foothills and the Pacific Ocean. It is one of the driest regions on Earth, receiving less than 4 millimeters of rain a year, a rugged wasteland of cracked soil, sun-baked stone, and low stunted brush. But this parched landscape hides something truly magical. Look down out your aircraft window, and strange shapes will begin to emerge, carved across the hills and plains below. Crisscrossing lines that run perfectly straight for kilometers, giant triangles, squares, spirals, and other geometric shapes. And most extraordinary of all, the figures of birds, whales, spiders, fish, and even humans stretching hundreds of meters across. These are the Nazca Lines, the largest geoglyphs in the world, and the masterworks of an ancient civilization that flourished and died out hundreds of years before Europeans arrived in the New World. Since their discovery nearly 100 years ago, the Nazca Lines have fascinated and baffled archaeologists the world over. Who were the Nazca people? How did they create such massive yet intricate artworks? And why? Were they an ancient calendar, symbols of fertility, or were these figures, most only visible from the air, meant for some more celestial audience? Well, let's find out as we explore the mystery of one of South America's greatest ancient wonders. The Nazca Lines were first mentioned in writing in the mid-16th century by Spanish conquistadors Pedro Cieza de Leon and Louis Monzon. However, as they could not see the full extent of the lines from ground level, they mistook them for roads or irrigation channels. This remained the accepted wisdom until the 20th century, when the development of aviation finally allowed the lines to be seen in their full glory. Though the lines were first described in 1927 by Peruvian archaeologist Torbio Zepe, who stumbled upon them while hiking through the Nazca foothills, the first person to study them in detail was Paul Kosuk, an American historian from Long Island University. Like most scholars before him, Kosuk initially believed that the lines were part of an ancient irrigation system. But while flying over the region in 1940, he discovered a group of lines forming the shape of an enormous bird. This discovery was followed by many more, with Kosuk uncovering a previously unknown menagerie of giant plant and animal drawings etched across the landscape, from monkeys, spiders, and birds to whales, flowers, and humanoid figures. On one flight, he even observed that a group of straight lines converged at the position of the sun during the winter solstice, suggesting that they had some sort of astronomical purpose. Kosuk immediately became obsessed with the Nazca Lines and was soon joined in his research by American archaeologist Richard Scale and German archaeologist and mathematician Maria Reich. Together, they set out to discover who created the lines, how exactly this impressive feat was accomplished, and most importantly, what purpose these giant figures served. The Nazca Lines are now known to have been created in two distinct phases: the Paracas phase, lasting from 400 to 200 BCE, and the Nazca phase, lasting from 200 BCE to 500 CE. The Paracas and Nazca cultures were two closely related pre-Inca peoples who lived in the areas of the Ica and Rio Grande de Nazca valleys between 800 BCE and 800 CE. In addition to the famous geoglyphs, the Nazca also constructed extensive networks of paquillos underground, which are still in use today. Yet, despite these achievements in large-scale construction, the Nazca were not an urban people, their only large architectural endeavor being Cahachi, a ceremonial complex of mounds and temples used only for religious purposes. Instead, the Nazca lived in smaller scattered villages, living off staple South American crops such as corn, squash, beans, and peanuts, as well as fish and other seafood from the Pacific Ocean. The most common artifacts to survive from the Nazca and earlier Paracas are intricately patterned textiles and sophisticated multicolored pottery. However, archaeologically, these cultures are perhaps best known for their distinctive burial practices. Like many Andean cultures, the Nazca and Paracas buried their dead sitting upright in mummy bundles, which were exposed to the air to naturally dry out and mummify. Unusually, however, many Nazca and Paracas graves feature partial burials in which limbs, skulls, and other body parts from multiple people are bundled together. Many normally bundled bodies have also been discovered with their skulls replaced with head jars, ceramic pots painted with the likeness of a human face. Indeed, so-called trophy heads played a huge role in Nazca religious culture. These are severed heads with holes drilled through the foreheads, allowing them to be suspended with ropes, and hundreds of these skulls have been found in Nazca settlements, while depictions of decapitation abound in Nazca pottery and even appear in the Nazca Lines, with one of figures depicting a half-human, half-orca beast holding a trophy head with more heads inside its body. But while they were initially believed to be trophies cut from the bodies of enemies in battle, later researchers suggested that the heads were in fact largely collected from within the Nazca community. However, some amount of ritual headhunting is still believed to have been practiced. Over the course of nearly a millennium, the Paracas and Nazca carved more than 1,300 kilometers of lines across an area of over 50 square kilometers. Some of these lines were then carved onto hillsides, allowing them to be seen from the ground, while others were carved on flat plains or hilltops and can only be fully seen from the air. Archaeologists typically group the Nazca lines into three main categories. The first are geometric lines, straight crisscrossing lines that can stretch across the landscape for several kilometers. There are also large geometric figures, including triangles, rectangles, wavy lines, and spirals. The second group are the representational figures, which take the form of animals and plants, including monkeys, lizards, spiders, birds like condors, herons, and hummingbirds, as well as dogs, cats, killer whales, flowers, and humanoid figures, the largest of which are up to 370 meters long. There are over 70 such figures known, with more being discovered every year. Finally, the last category of lines are the tracks, which are wider than usual and believed to be paths designed to convey large numbers of people to ritual sites. Just like the who, the how of the Nazca lines is also fairly straightforward. The figures were created by excavating the dark iron oxide coated stones and topsoil from the desert floor, exposing the pale yellow-grey soil beneath. The width and depth of these excavations varies widely, ranging from 30 to 150 centimeters wide and 10 to 15 centimeters deep. Once the excavation was completed, the little moisture that does blow into the region from the ocean caused the clay-rich subsoil to harden into a sort of mortar or cement, making the lines especially durable. The lack of rainfall and wind also greatly slowed soil erosion, allowing the lines to survive almost perfectly intact for more than 1,500 years. The real question, however, is how the Nazca managed to draw such enormous figures with such accuracy without being able to see the entire design at once from ground level. Unfortunately, as is always the case with archaeological mysteries of this kind, the secret of the Nazca lines has attracted an old familiar explanation. Stay with me now, because it's aliens. In his infamous 1968 book, Chariots of the Gods, Swedish writer Eric von Daniken argued that the ancient peoples of Peru could never have created the giant figures on their own, and that the Nazca lines were instead made as landing pads for alien beings whom the Paracas and Nazca worshipped as gods. Much like all ancient aliens explanations, von Daniken's claims regarding the Nazca's abilities are very easily debunked. For example, in 1982, American skeptic and paranormal investigator Joe Nickell used simple tools and techniques readily available to the Nazca, specifically scale drawings, wooden stakes, and ropes, to draw a 130-meter-long replica of the condor geoglyph in a field in Kentucky. As Nickell explains, that is, on the small drawing, we would measure along the center line from one end of the bird's beak to a point on the line directly opposite the point to be plotted, say a wingtip. Then we would measure the distance from the center line to the desired point. A given number of units on the small drawing would require the same number of units, larger units, on the large drawing. And if you're wondering on this one, the remains of wooden stakes have been unearthed at many of the sites and carbon dated to the Nazca period, lending further credence to Nickell's theories. Furthermore, the fact that many of the lines can only be seen from the air makes perfect sense if they were intended to be seen by the Nazca people's pantheon of gods. Thus, sadly, as ever, the answer is in aliens. Yet. Finally, we come to the third and perhaps the most important question about the Nazca lines: why they were made. Unfortunately, this is the question for which we have the fewest answers, with the ultimate function of the Nazca lines still a matter of archaeological debate. The first scholarly analysis of the lines function was conducted by the aforementioned Maria Reich, who devoted over 40 years to studying the lines and became known to the locals as the Angel of the Plains and the Lady of the Lines. In a 1949 book, The Secrets of the Pampas, Reich, like Paul Kosok before her, posited that the Nazca Lines served as a giant astronomical calendar with many of the figures representing constellations in the sky. Starting in the 1960s, however, these views began to be challenged by archaeologists like Johann Reinhardt, who in his 1985 book, The Nazca Lines, A New Perspective on Their Origin and Meanings, argued that, quote, it seems likely that most of the lines did not point at anything on the geographical or celestial horizon, but rather led to places where rituals were performed to obtain water and fertility of crops. This interpretation is supported by a 2019 study conducted by researchers from 3 Japanese research institutes, which revealed that few of the birds depicted in the Nazca Lines are native to Pampas da Jamana. Among the species identified by the team are hermit hummingbirds, pelicans, Guarne cormorants, pelicans, and parrots. As Masaki Ida of the Hokkaido University Museum explains, if exotic, non-local birds were not significant for the Nazca people, there would be no reason to draw their geoglyph, so their existence should be closely related to the purpose of etching geoglyphs. But the reason is difficult to answer. According to Johann Reinhardt's theories, the fact that all these birds are native to wetter, more forested areas of Peru indicates that the Nazca used them as symbols of water and fertility. But if indeed the Nazca did use the lines to pray for water, they were to be bitterly disappointed, for in around 500 CE, a massive drought swept across the Andean plateau, leading to the collapse of the Nazca civilization. Sadly, recent discoveries suggest that the Nazca themselves played a major role in their own demise. Archaeological excavations in the Pampas de Jamana have uncovered the remains of harango trees, indicating that the area was once covered in lush forests. These forests, however, were systematically cut down by the Nazca to clear land for crops such as corn. This, in turn, left the soil vulnerable to erosion, leading to a gradual process of desertification. As David Beresford-Jones of Cambridge University explains, the harango tree is the ecological keystone species in this desert zone, enhancing soil fertility and moisture, ameliorating desert extremes in the microclimate beneath its canopy, and underpinning the floodplain with one of the deepest root systems of any tree known. In time, gradual woodland clearance crossed an ecological threshold sharply defined in such desert environments, exposing the landscape to the region's extraordinary desert winds and the effects of El Niño floods. Thus, in one of history's great ironies, the bare hills and plains that made the Nazca Lines visible to the gods were responsible for the very droughts and loss of crop productivity the gods were being called upon to reverse. A similar fate befell many other ancient civilizations, including the people of Rapa Nui or Easter Island, who cut down so many trees in order to move and erect their Moai stoneheads that it triggered an ecological disaster. Today, however, it is the lines themselves which are under threat. Despite the geoglyphs being declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1994, encroaching human activity threatens to erase these extraordinary constructions, which have withstood the elements for a millennium and a half. The Pan-American Highway, which connects the Americas from Canada to Argentina, cuts through several of the geoglyphs, while in recent years large groups of squatters settling in the area have inflicted damage to the lines and Nazca period cemeteries through the construction of houses and pig corrals. Illegal miners have also destroyed several sites while excavating limestone. In 2013, illegal limestone miners destroyed a site in the Department of Buenos Aires, while the following year, the environmental activist group Greenpeace erected a large banner reading, "Time for change, the future is renewable," beside the Hummingbird figure to protest a UN climate summit in Lima. The stunt damaged the site and outraged the Peruvian government, who forced Greenpeace to issue a formal apology. This rapid destruction is especially alarming given that more and more previously unknown Nazca figures are being discovered every year. In 2020, a new 37-meter-long geoglyph of a cat was discovered on a hillside, while the year before, a team from Yamagata University in Japan used satellite imagery and IBM's Watson supercomputer to locate 142 new geoglyphs that were too eroded to spot with the naked eye. Only time will tell how many more lie out there on the Pampas de Jamana waiting to be discovered, or whether human action will erase these ancient wonders before we even get the chance to find them.
The idea of paying for yourself when out with friends being referred to as some expression including the word Dutch, seemingly incorrectly, is often attributed to the fact that for several centuries, beginning in the 17th, the word Dutch has had a negative connotation in English, variously meaning cheap, duplicitous, alcoholic, poor, treacherous, selfish, or just plain wrong. The derogatory usage of Dutch stems from animosity between the English and the Dutch due to their competing positions as naval powers, which would ultimately erupt into full-on wars, mostly fought at sea. It's no surprise then that by the middle of the 17th century, when war broke out, the English had come up with some choice derogatory expressions related to their rivals. Specifically, by 1654, the first derogatory uses of Dutch began appearing in print, such as R. Whitcock's Warrior. The contract is not like Dutch bargains made in drink. Soon, phrases such as Dutch palate, 1687, meaning low class, and Dutch reckoning, 1699, meaning poor accounting, particularly a bill that doesn't include details and potentially becomes bigger if you question it, were also appearing. That said, contrary to what is often said, none of this appears to have anything to do with the various Dutch expressions meaning to pay for oneself. In fact, the origin of this expression might even have little to do with what we think of today as Dutch at all. In the 17th and 18th centuries, many German-speaking groups immigrated to the United States. For those that settled in Pennsylvania, they became known as Pennsylvania Dutch. As for why these German-speaking people were called this in the first place, well, for some time in English, High Dutch generally referred to people from parts of Germany and in nearby mountainous regions, and Low Dutch got applied to people from the Netherlands, at a time with these regions being part of the Holy Roman Empire. Even after they got their respective independence, the naming schemes still stuck around for a while in certain places like America. In the United States, it would seem that the Pennsylvania Dutch had a reputation for never owing anyone anything, to the point that, even with a group of friends in a tavern, the reputation was that each person would pay his own bill. Whether this reputation is wholly accurate or not, in the United States, various phrases that included the word Dutch became synonymous with this characteristic, and eventually different variations with the meaning began to appear in print, including Dutch Treat, 1873, Dutch Lunch, 1897, and Go Dutch from 1914. For instance, the earliest documented instance of the first of these line of expressions appeared in the Daily Democrat on June 27, 1873, stating, "If our temperance friends could institute what is called the Dutch Treat into our saloons, each man paying his reckoning, it would be a long step towards reforming in drinking to excess." The next up was the Dutch Lunch, with the first known instance appearing in the Fort Wayne Morning Journal on October 24, 1897. Perhaps you have a fatter pocketbook than some of the other fellows. I, for instance, can't afford to buy 2 tickets every time I go. So some of the boys and I go on the Dutch Lunch plan, everybody for himself. Interestingly, at the same time these expressions were taking on their figurative sense, they were also occasionally used literally, as in describing the food eaten by the Pennsylvania Dutch. To wit, an 1894 newspaper report found by esteemed etymologist Michael Quinion of the trusted phenomenal Worldwise Words notes that a Dutch supper should include rye bread, cabbage salad, wienerwursts, and beer, consistently expressive of the Vaterland. Given that this line of Dutch something expressions didn't appear until the late 19th to early 20th centuries, that they first appeared in the United States rather than Britain, that they seem in many cases to be referring to Pennsylvania Dutch, and they aren't inherently derogatory, it's thought by many etymologists that, contrary to what is often said, these expressions probably had nothing to do with the former lineup of derogatory Dutch something expressions invented by the British a couple of centuries before. The word has been in English pretty much as long as there has been English. It's actually derived from the Old English word soir. It is alternatively an adverb, it's so hot, a conjunction, eat your dinner so you can have dessert, an adjective, Jim is dead, isn't that so, and an introductory particle, so I heard gunshots last night. For many, the ubiquity of so to introduce a topic or an idea in modern parlance, so what are we doing, is troubling and often thought to be a recent addition to the language. However, English speakers have actually been using so to open a sentence since at least the Middle Ages. For example, Chaucer used so as an introductory particle in his poem Troilus and Cresseid. And just note here, in the reading of these, I'm updating it into modern English. So grant him soon out of this world to pass, and so when this calcus knew by astrological calculation, and so hide it well, I tell it never to others. Shakespeare also introduced sentences with so. In the poem The Rape of Lucrece, here are 6 instances. Number 1, so guiltless she securely give good cheer. 2, so that in venturing ill we leave to be. 3, so from himself impiety hath wrought. 4, so thy surviving husband shall remain. 5. So shall these slaves be king, and though their slave. And 6. So let thy thoughts low vassals to thy state. In the 18th century, Samuel Richardson also used so in this way in the novel Pamela. Here are 4 instances. 1. So like a fool, I was ready to cry. 2. So with our blessings and assured prayers for you, more than ourselves we remain. 3. So dear father and mother, it is not disobedience. And 4. So taunting again. So did Richard Brinsley Sherida in his comedy Of Manners the Rivals, and there are 5 instances. 1. So, what this is some freak I warrant. 2. So come to me presently, and I'll give you another letter to Sir Lucius. 3. So, my dear simplicity, let me give you a little respite. 4. So, here he comes. And 5. So, that's done. Well, I'll fold it up presently. Nonetheless, the so haters do have a point that it is used much more ubiquitously in recent years. As for why though, well, that's up for debate, with the most common theory putting the blame on Silicon Valley lingo. This was first noted by Michael Lewis in The New Thing from 1999, where he writes, "When a computer programmer answers a question, he often begins with the word so." As to how this came about, it is thought that given the international composition of the typical Silicon Valley worksite where a large number did not speak English as their first language, it became the simple catch-all word of transition. Over time and frequent usage, it eventually became like a tick and just a part of the common speech pattern of those in that industry, and then it spread beyond. It's a far better starter than or well, which convey uncertainty, whereas so connotes authority. It also indicates that something has been thought through. In the same vein, when it is used to answer a question rather than raise a point, inserting a so buys time, either to formulate a response or ignore the question and return to another topic. In addition, communications professor Galina Bolden of Rutgers University notes that beginning sentences with so communicates that the speaker is interested in or concerned about the recipient. It also invokes prior conversations between the speaker and the recipient, drawing on their relationship history. So, given its utility and appearance of authority, as well as sometimes helping to avoid awkward silence while you think, it is no wonder so has become so popular. Of course, as with all lingual conversations, it can be, and often is, overused. But since so has been with us since pretty much the beginning of the language and just keeps increasing in popularity, the so haters might just have to hunker down and endure while the present wave passes.
Valdivia, Chile, May the 22nd, 1960. Magnitude 9.5, 1,655 killed. Prince William Sound, Alaska, March 26, 1964. Magnitude 9.2, 128 killed. Sumatra, Indonesia, December 26, 2004. Magnitude 9.1, 227,898 killed. Tohoku, Japan, March the 11th, 2011, magnitude 9.1, 15,700 killed. These are the 4 most powerful earthquakes in recorded history. If you keep up with the news, then you've likely heard of earthquakes being measured and compared by magnitude, particularly using something called the Richter Scale. But how does this scale actually work? How do seismologists gauge the strength of one of the most complicated geological phenomena known? Oh, well, grab your emergency kit and take shelter under the newest doorway as we dive into the fascinating science and history of measuring earthquakes. Now, before we begin, it is important to note that while the Richter scale has become synonymous with earthquake measurement, the scale proper is actually no longer used, having been replaced in 1979 by the more accurate and versatile moment magnitude scale. However, for moderate earthquake intensities, the 2 scales are roughly similar, and to understand the current system, it is necessary to understand the history and development of its famous predecessor. The remote detection and measurement of earthquakes is a surprisingly ancient practice, with the first modern seismometer being built in China in 132 CE by the great Han Dynasty mathematician and scientist Chang Heng. This instrument consisted of a 2-meter tall, egg-shaped bronze vessel, around which were mounted 8 sculpted dragons with hinged jaws holding a small metal ball. Below these sat 8 bronze frogs with open mouths. Inside the vessel hung a heavy metal pendulum, which was linked to each of the dragon's jaws. When the seismic waves from a distant earthquake passed through the instrument, the vessel moved while the pendulum stayed still via inertia. This in turn caused the dragon facing the direction of the earthquake's epicenter to release its ball into the frog's mouth. The instrument proved remarkably effective, as Chang Heng later wrote, "On one occasion, one of the dragons let fall a ball from its mouth through no perceptible shock that could be felt. All the scholars at the capital, Chang'an, were astonished at this strange effect occurring without any evidence of an earthquake to cause it. But several days later, a messenger arrived bringing news of an earthquake in Lungxi, 400 miles away. Upon this, everyone admitted the mysterious power of the instrument." So, while modern seismometers are more sensitive and include systems for accurately measuring and recording seismic waves, they all fundamentally work on the same basic principle as Chang Heng's pioneering design, using a pendulum or a weight suspended on springs as the detection element. However, such instruments would not be developed until the 1920s, meaning early scales for classifying earthquakes were based on their physical effects, aka its intensity. One of the earliest was the Rossi-Forel scale, developed by seismologists Michel Stefano Conte de Rossi and François-Alphonse Forel in 1873. Divided into 10 categories, like the Beaufort scale for measuring wind speed, the Rossi-Forel scale was based on qualitative observations of common earthquake effects. For example, an intensity 1 and 2 earthquake was unnoticeable by most people. An intensity 5 earthquake could shift furniture and ring church bells. An intensity 7 earthquake could crack walls and bring down chimneys, while an intensity 10 earthquake was the most catastrophic of all, capable of leveling entire cities and tearing open the ground. This scale remained in use until 1902, when Italian volcanologist Giuseppe Mercalli developed his eponymous Mercalli scale, which used 12 points instead of 10, though intensity 1 still represented an earthquake undetectable by humans, and intensity 12 a catastrophic disaster. In 1931, Mercalli's scale was refined by American seismologists Harry Wood and Frank Newman to produce the modified Mercalli scale, which is still used today, by the way. But such intensity scales were highly subjective, and as truly reliable seismometers became available in the 1920s, it soon became clear that the observed intensity of earthquakes on the ground did not match up neatly with its measured magnitude, that is, the actual energy released at its hypocenter. Indeed, it was found that the intensity of an earthquake, its effects on the surface, depends as much on the depth of the hypocenter as the actual magnitude of the earthquake. In other words, a shallower, less powerful earthquake can inflict more surface damage than a deeper, more powerful one. And in case you were wondering, the epicenter of an earthquake is its origin point on the Earth's surface, while the hypocenter lies below the epicenter, where the tectonic plates actually collide. To correct this mismatch and standardize earthquake measurements, in 1935, American seismologist Charles Francis Richter introduced his famous eponymous scale, which he initially referred to simply as the local magnitude scale, or simply the magnitude scale. The scale was based on the then standard Wood-Anderson torsion seismograph and expressed earthquake intensities as the logarithm of the maximum amplitude or height of the recorded seismic waves expressed in microns or micrometers. This means that the Richter scale is not linear. Instead, each whole number magnitude represents an earthquake 10 times more powerful than the previous number. For example, a magnitude 4 earthquake is 1,000 times more powerful than a magnitude 1. Meanwhile, the total energy released by an earthquake increases 31.7 times between whole number magnitude values. Richter's magnitudes were calibrated such that a magnitude 3 earthquake detected by a Wood-Anderson seismometer located 100 kilometers from the epicenter would produce a trace on the recording chart 1 millimeter tall. As the measured intensity of seismic waves changes with distance, Richter also created a table of correction factors to account for the actual position of the seismograph and the effects of local geology. In practice, the magnitude of a particular earthquake was determined by averaging the readings of multiple seismographs, each corrected for their respective distance from the epicenter. While Richter's name has become synonymous with this method, his was actually a refinement of a similar method developed by a Japanese seismologist, Kiyu Wadati, in 1931. Richter originally developed his scale specifically for use in California, where earthquakes tend to be moderate in magnitude and seismometers are never more than 600 kilometers from the epicenter. Because of this and the relatively low sensitivity of early seismometers, the weakest earthquakes registered as magnitude 1 and the strongest around magnitude 8. However, as more and more seismographs were installed around the world, seismologists discovered that the accuracy of the Richter scale fell apart at greater magnitudes and distances. At magnitudes above 6.5, values calculated using Richter's method tend to cluster or saturate near one another, causing the total energy release to be underestimated. Furthermore, as seismometers became ever more sensitive, period, they became capable of detecting earthquakes at magnitudes lower than 1, which, given the logarithmic nature of the Richter scale, translated into negative magnitude values. To address these shortcomings, Richter and his colleague Benno Gutenberg developed the body wave magnitude and surface wave magnitude scales. The former measures the magnitude of the primary or P waves and the secondary or S seismic waves that travel through the Earth's interior, while the latter measures the so-called Love and Rayleigh waves that travel along the Earth's surface. As the Love and Rayleigh waves of earthquakes above magnitude 4.5 can travel all the way around the world, the surface wave magnitude scale has no distance restrictions and can be measured from anywhere on the Earth's surface. But while these scales were a marked improvement over Richter's original local magnitude scale, magnitude values still tended to saturate at magnitudes above 8. And so, in 1979, Japanese seismologist Hiroru Kanamori and American seismologist Thomas C. Hanks introduced an entirely new measurement system, the moment magnitude scale. Instead of measuring the peak amplitude of seismic waves recorded on a seismometer, the moment magnitude scale is instead based on an earthquake's seismic movement, that is, the total displacement or slip of the tectonic fault across its entire surface during an earthquake multiplied by the force needed to move said fault. This method avoids the saturation problem, allowing earthquakes above magnitude 8 to be accurately measured. However, the scale still expresses magnitudes logarithmically, and at moderate value lines up almost exactly with the old Richter scale. Thus, even though all seismologists now use the moment magnitude scale to report earthquake magnitude using the term Richter scale, as news reporters sometimes do, is still technically accurate in most cases. But what do the numbers on the moment magnitude scale actually mean? As the Earth's tectonic plates are constantly in motion, earthquakes are happening all the time somewhere in the world. The vast majority of these quakes, however, are minuscule and undetectable by humans. Millions of such microquakes occur every year, registering at magnitudes between 1 and 1.9. Going up the scale, magnitude 5 to 5.9 earthquakes are considered moderate, but being readily felt by humans and capable of inflicting minor damage to buildings and other infrastructure. Around 1,000 to 1,500 of these earthquakes occur every year worldwide. Magnitude 7 to 7.9 earthquakes, on the other hand, are considered major and can inflict major damage to buildings across a radius of 250 kilometers from the epicenter. Around 10 to 20 such quakes occur every year. And finally, at the other end of the scale are extreme earthquakes of magnitude 9 or higher. Since regular seismic monitoring began in the early 20th century, only 5 earthquakes of this magnitude have ever been recorded.
Abracadabra. These days you might hear abracadabra before some stage magician pulls a rabbit out of his hat, but hundreds of years ago people actually believed that abracadabra was a magical spell. The exact origin of the word is up for debate, but perhaps one of the oldest records we have of abracadabra being used is a snippet from a Roman sage named Serenus Sammonicus in the 2nd century AD from his Liber Medicinalis. The malady the Greeks call hemitrateos is more deadly. None of our ancestors could name this disease in our own language, nor did they feel the need to. On a piece of parchment, write the so-called abracadabra several times, repeating it on the line below, but take off the end, so that gradually individual letters, which you will take away each time, are missing from the word. Continue until the last letter makes the apex of a cone. Remember to wind this with linen and hang it around the neck. Many people say that the lard of a lion is effective. It's unlikely that Sammonicus came up with the word on his own, and it is thought to have been in use before then. There are a couple of theories as to where it might have ultimately come from. First, it could have been derived from the equally magical word abraxas, whose letters in Greek numerology add up to 365, the number of days in the year. It could be that the early sages thought this was a powerful word and somehow created abracadabra out of it and turned it into a cure. Alternatively, the word might be derived from the Hebrew words for Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, A, Ben, Ruach, Hakadesh, respectively. Perhaps more intuitively, it could be derived from the Aramaic phrase Abracadabra. Harry Potter fans will likely know that this is what J.K. Rowling used when she was coming up with the killing curse, Avada Kedavra. In an interview, she stated that the original phrase meant let the thing be destroyed, though there is some debate on whether she is correct on this. Nonetheless, this would suit the cure theory well. Abracadabra was written to destroy the sickness. As strange as it may seem today, people did wear talismans of sorts with the abracadabra cone, as Sammonicus described. It was thought to cure diseases, fever, and other problems by siphoning it out of the person and expelling it through the bottom A. Obviously, it would have no more than a placebo effect on the user, but people seem to put a lot of stock in it. For example, in the 1500s, Eva Remington Taylor wrote The Troublesome Voyage of Captain Edward Fenton, in which she claimed, Bannister saith yet he healed 200 in 1 year of an ague by hanging abracadabra around their necks. Abracadabra was still used as a cure well into the 18th century, as evidenced by a 1722 book by Daniel Defoe titled Journal of Plague Year, which lamented the use of such charms.
People deceived, and this was in wearing charms, philters, exorcisms, amulets, and I know not what preparations, to fortify the body with them against the plague, as if the plague was but a kind of possession of an evil spirit, and that it was to be kept off with crossings, signs of the zodiac, papers tied with so many knots, and certain words or figures written on them, as particularly the word abracadabra, formed in the triangle or pyramid. How the poor people found the insufficiency of those things, and how many of them were afterwards carried away in the dead carts.
Eventually, people let go of the abracadabra superstition, and by the 19th century, the practice of hanging an abracadabra charm around your neck to cure disease had died down. At this point, the word started to take on the meaning of fake magic, which is what we know today. After all, magicians don't actually make rabbits appear out of thin air. Or do they? Bonus facts. Cadavra in Turkish means cadaver or corpse. Bonus fact 2. Many other Harry Potter spells have a Latin origin. Expelliarmus, the disarming charm, combines expelliare, to drive or force out, with armor or weapon, making it to force out a weapon. Lumus, the wand-lighting spell, derives from lumen, meaning light. Crucio, or the Cruciatus curse, is a torturing spell that translates to I torture. Bonus fact 3. Hocus pocus, another common phrase used for fake magic, didn't come about until the 17th century, when a conjurer came up with the phrase for part of his act.
Hocus pocus tontus talonus vade celetria jubeo.
It's entirely possible that this was derived from the phrase spoken at Catholic Mass, hoc est enim corpus meum, or for this is my body. Another theory is that it derives from the Norse demon Ocus Bocchus, and calling his name would make him help with whatever magic was meant to be done. It's possible that hocus pocus later evolved into the word hoax. Bonus fact 4. Presto simply means quickly in Italian. It was used by magicians who were attempting to call up demons and apparently wanted them to hurry up.